The first sign was always the heat, a strange, restless warmth that clung to the skin like damp wool, rising under the collar just as the lamplighters finished their rounds. Families in narrow brick houses would whisper that it was simply a winter fever, nothing more. Yet by dawn, the flush spread dark, mottled, sinister, blooming across faces like a punishment no one dared name. In parlours and workhouses alike, the air grew heavy with camphor, vinegar, and fear, while the city itself seemed to flinch from the word that hovered behind every closed door: smallpox. Physicians arrived with their polished bags and trembling certainty, offering powders, poultices, and prayers in equal measure. Nurses tied curtains shut to keep out the watchful neighbours, for nothing spread faster than suspicion except the sickness itself. The disease moved through London like a quiet footstep on bare floors, touching children first, then mothers, then whole streets marked by the chalk X that meant danger within. Even the most elegant drawing rooms could not hide their terror. Silk gloves and lace veils offered no armour against an illness that stalked rich and poor without prejudice. And when the pustules came, those pale, rising pearls of agony, there was no denying it. The smell, sweet and metallic, drifted through corridors like a mournful perfume. Families whispered behind bedroom doors, doctors whispered in hallways, and Britain whispered to itself that the old plague had returned again, as relentless as London fog. So before we step deeper into these dim corridors of Victorian fear, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Your presence keeps these stories alive, even in the shadows where history once trembled. The trouble always began with a warmth that felt too deliberate, too watchful, an unsettling heat rising beneath the collar as though an invisible hand had brushed the skin and lingered there. In a narrow terraced house off Whitechapel Road, the warmth crept over young Edwin Harcourt just as the lamps along the street guttered into life. His mother noticed it first, a flush across his cheeks that looked almost charming in the weak glow of the fire. Children warmed easily, she told herself. Children ran, played, laughed. But this warmth did not fade with evening. It deepened, it pulsed, it climbed. Outside, London's winter fog pressed against the windowpanes like a damp blanket, turning the street into a smudged watercolour of smoke and shadow. Inside, the parlour held the thick scent of boiled wool and cheap coal, an odour that clung to every garment, every curtain. Yet beneath it, something new began to rise. A sweetness, faint but unmistakable, drifting from Edwin's skin like a perfumed warning. The boy's breath grew shallow. His mother's hands trembled as she pressed her palm to his forehead. He burned. She sent her eldest daughter running for Dr. Avery, the man with the polished black bag and the quiet voice. The doctor arrived within the hour, coat dusted with soot, spectacles fogged from the cold. He knelt beside Edwin's bed and frowned deeply, silently. His fingers hovered over the child's flushed skin as though afraid to touch. In truth, he was. Every doctor in Victorian London feared the warmth that refused to cool, the flush that refused to fade, the breath that quickened as if preparing to disappear. Smallpox was a familiar enemy, but that did not make it a less terrifying one. Dr. Avery asked questions in a voice softened by dread. Had Edwin visited the market this week? Had the family welcomed travellers? Were their neighbours ill? His inquiries were as methodical as the disease itself, probing for entry points, connections, hidden threads of contagion that London spun so effortlessly among its millions. The mother answered each question with growing hesitation, as though speaking the truth might summon the disease more fully into the room. When the doctor finally lifted the candle to Edwin's face, the light trembled. There, just beneath the surface, lay the faintest constellation of spots, barely visible, but undeniable to a trained eye. Pale, rising, deliberate, the first whisper of what was to come. Dr. Avery exhaled slowly, as if releasing a secret he wished he had never learned. He closed his bag with a click that sounded far too final. "You must keep him warm," he said quietly, "but not too warm." He hesitated. "And I advise you to keep the other children away." The mother's face drained of color. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the door, toward her sleeping daughters, her husband returning from the docks, her elderly mother dozing in the next room. Smallpox had not yet crossed their threshold fully, but its shadow had slipped inside, curling into corners like the fog pressing against the glass. By nightfall, the flush deepened into a fever that made Edwin's small body tremble. His breathing rasped, his fingers clawed weakly at the blankets. The sweet, metallic scent in the room grew stronger, settling over the family like a veil no one dared lift. Outside, the lamplighters passed with long poles, their flames flickering in the fog. They did not look up at the house. They never did. On streets like this, warmth was rarely a harmless thing. Inside, the Harcourt family waited for morning, though morning would bring no comfort. For in Victorian Britain, the first heat beneath the collar was not merely a symptom, it was a verdict. Dr. Nathaniel Avery walked home through the fog, as if moving through a dream thick with coal dust and unspoken dread. His polished black bag, lacquered, heavy, and too often filled with disappointment, swung gently at his side. The brass clasp clicked with each step, a small, metallic heartbeat in the stillness of Whitechapel's evening. It was a sound London had learned to fear, for wherever that bag opened, trouble followed. He had left the Harcourt house with his collar turned up and his mind clouded by what he had seen. The fevered flush, the small pearled spots rising like a cruel constellation under the child's skin. Avery had witnessed this pattern too many times to pretend it might be something gentler. Smallpox announced itself with the delicacy of a whisper and the certainty of a hammer, and once it crept into a household through a market visit, a borrowed shawl, a neighbor's handshake, it seldom left without taking someone with it. He paused beneath a sputtering gas lamp. Its flame flickered in the wind, casting his shadow against the brick wall in a long, distorted shape. He could still smell the child's fever on his gloves, sweet, acid, soft, unmistakable. He rubbed his fingertips together as though he might erase the memory. But the scent clung to him, the way it clung to every doctor who had stared into the hollowed eyes of the sick and recognized the first sign of a disease older than the alleyways themselves. As he resumed walking, Avery passed clusters of factory workers heading home, their boots coated in grime, their breaths fogging the air in uneven ghosts. They nodded at him respectfully, stepping aside as though he carried invisible authority or invisible danger. Some whispered his name under their breath. Others pretended not to recognize him at all. Doctors were both sought after and avoided in these quarters. A man visited by one was often a man marked by misfortune. Avery knew that by morning, news of his visit to the Harcourts would spread faster than the infection itself. The neighborhood grapevine, made of laundresses, shopkeepers, and watchful widows, was relentless. They'd seen him step through that narrow doorway with his polished bag and grave expression. They knew what such visits meant. Before long, someone would mutter that they'd heard coughing next door, or that a child across the street had been flushed last Sunday after church. Rumor was a disease with its own cruelty. He reached his townhouse at last, a quiet, respectable home on a street where the fog drifted more politely and the lamps burned a little brighter. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Yet even here, Avery could not shake the weight of the polished bag in his hand. He placed it on the hallway table and stood over it for a long moment as though expecting it to speak. It glistened darkly under the lamplight, reflecting a warped image of his face. He imagined its contents, glass vials clinking softly, folded bandages still unstained, a stethoscope that had heard too many dying breaths. Tools of healing? Yes, but against smallpox, they were little more than props in a grim performance. He had powders for fever, tinctures for pain, poultices for the rash. None of it stopped the progression. None of it softened the moment when the pustules ripened and the body surrendered. Avery removed his gloves and dropped them into a basin. The water shivered as they sank. His hands, though washed and scrubbed raw, still felt unclean. He flexed his fingers, remembering the tremor he had tried to conceal at the Harcourt's bedside. Every doctor cultivated a mask, calm, confident, detached. But the mask always cracked in private, especially after a visit like this one. He moved to the window and parted the curtains just enough to peer out. The street was quiet, rippled with fog, lantern light shimmering like tears in the mist. Somewhere far away, he heard the distant toll of a church bell announcing the evening hour. It felt too solemn, too expectant, as though the city itself waited for something dreadful to unfold. And Avery knew it would. The first case was never the last. He closed the curtains and extinguished the lamp, leaving only the polished bag gleaming in the half-dark, an omen more than an instrument. It would open again tomorrow. It always did. At dawn, when the fog still clung low enough to brush against the cobblestones, a thin figure in a black overcoat moved quietly along Whitechapel Road. His boots made no sound on the wet stones, and he kept his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. In his gloved hand he carried a small tin of chalk white, dusty and feared. With each house he approached, the neighbourhood seemed to hold its breath. He stopped before the Harcourt residence. The curtains were drawn tight, as they had been since Dr. Avery's late-night visit, and the faintest glimmer of firelight flickered behind the lace. Inside, the family waited in suffocating silence, listening for this very moment. Outside, the man dipped 2 fingers into the tin and withdrew a stick of chalk worn nearly to the nub. He hesitated. He had marked dozens of houses over the years, but the hesitation always came small, human, fragile. Then, with a swift, practiced stroke, he drew the symbol, a large, raw X, across the wooden door. It was not a mark of death, though many saw it as such. It was a warning, a boundary, a quiet sentence passed not by a judge, but by the city itself. Once the chalk X appeared, the house was no longer just a home, it became a cautionary tale etched in white powder, visible to all who dared look. From the neighbouring window, Mrs. Finch watched silently. Her hand trembled around her teacup, porcelain rattling ever so slightly. She had suspected as much. She had seen the doctor enter with his polished bag, had watched the Harcourt girl fetch vinegar, had noticed the hurried drawing of curtains. But suspicion was one thing, confirmation was another. The chalk X meant one truth. Smallpox had entered their street. She closed her curtains without drinking her tea. The marking officer stepped back to study his work, though there was little artistry in it. The X was crude, thick, unmistakable. In a day or two, the chalk would begin to smudge from damp fingers or curious children, but the message would linger. Do not enter. More importantly, do not let anything leave. Behind the door, Mrs. Harcourt sank into a chair, the sound of chalk on wood still ringing in her ears. It felt as though someone had drawn the mark across her own chest. She had known this moment would come, had felt it in the fevered heat of her son's skin, in the doctor's grave expression, in the hush that settled over the household after midnight. But knowing did not soften the blow. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, time withered. Her youngest daughter crept into the room, clutching her doll. "Mama," she whispered, "why is there an X on our door? Did we do something wrong?" She pulled the girl into her lap and smoothed her hair. "It's just to keep people safe, my love, that's all." But even as she spoke the words, she felt their hollowness. The X kept people out, but it also locked them in. As morning wore on, the street transformed. Children who once played hopscotch along the pavement now hurried past the Harcourt home, eyes averted, feet scuffling nervously. Market women carrying baskets of turnips and bread shifted their weight, crossing to the other side without a word. Even the milkman, usually jovial with his clinking bottles and muddied boots, paused at the corner before deciding silently to skip the house altogether. Fear travelled faster than any messenger. By noon, whispers curled through the neighbourhood like rising steam from a kettle. "Did you see it?" Another one marked. "They say the boy is only 9. My cousin lost his eldest to it last winter, went from fever to delirium in 3 days. It's back again, proper back." The Harcourts heard none of the whispers, yet felt all of them. The air inside grew heavy, as though the very walls knew they had been written off by the world beyond. Dr. Avery was expected to return sometime that afternoon, but until then, the house existed in a kind of purgatory cut off, suspended, waiting. Outside, the chalk continued to dry, settling into the grain of the wood like a branding. It was only one symbol, one quick gesture. But for the Harcourts and countless families before them, the chalk X meant everything that lay ahead: fever, fear, isolation, and the slow, dreadful unfolding of a disease that cared nothing for prayers or courage. And as the fog thickened once more along the street, the mark glowed faintly under the lamplight, a stark reminder that smallpox had returned, and it had chosen another door. The chalk X had barely dried before the whispers began, thin, fluttering things that slipped through lace curtains and across narrow streets with the same quiet insistence as the disease itself. In Victorian London, illness travelled in 2 forms: the fever that ravaged bodies and the gossip that ravaged reputations. And in Whitechapel, where houses leaned so close they seemed to share a single heartbeat, news rarely needed more than a breath to spread. By the late afternoon, nearly every window along the row held a shadow behind the curtain, its owner peering out toward the Harcourt house as though staring at a crime scene. Curtains twitched, lamps dimmed. Conversations grew soft and urgent, like prayers spoken under bedcovers. Mrs. Finch, who considered herself the unofficial sentinel of the street, had already gathered her neighbours for an impromptu meeting near her parlour hearth. The fire crackled politely in the grate, though no one dared move too close to it. Warmth suddenly felt like an omen. She stood by the window, hands clasped around her rosary, watching the Harcourt's silent doorway, as if expecting the sickness itself to slip out and knock. "It's smallpox," she declared in a voice that wavered between dread and self-importance. "I saw the doctor last night and this morning." The mark went up. "There can be no doubt." Several women gasped softly, pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths. Others shook their heads, insisting they already knew. In truth, everyone had known from the moment Dr. Avery crossed the threshold with that solemn bag of his. But speaking it aloud gave the fear substance, as though naming the disease lent it claws. Mrs. Whitlow, whose 3 children had all survived the measles but carried the scars of poverty on their cheeks, leaned forward. "Do they say how the lad caught it? Was it the market, the school?" No one answered. No one needed to. Outside the parlour, the street carried its own choir of whispers. 2 washerwomen murmured over a fence, wringing their hands as if wringing out the infection. A butcher's assistant stepped outside to smoke, only to hastily flick his match away when he realized he was staring at the Harcourt's windows for too long. Even the constable paused at the corner before continuing his rounds with an air of forced indifference. Behind the marked door, those whispers reached the Harcourt household like faint echoes, barely audible, but sharp enough to cut. "Mrs." Harcourt sat at Edwin's bedside, the boy's feverish breath rasping against the stillness. Each time the street murmured, she felt it like a draught against her spine. She knew her neighbours were watching. She knew they were talking. She imagined the words passing from house to house like a contagion of judgment. "It's the Harcourts. The boy is failing. Keep your children away. Best not to touch their fence or their gate." It starts with one family. Her youngest daughter, Clara, sat on the floor with her doll clasped tightly in her arms. "Mama," she whispered, "are people afraid of us now?" The question pierced the mother more deeply than any symptom. She smoothed Clara's hair and kissed her forehead, though she felt suddenly older, wearier, smaller. "No, darling, they're only afraid of the sickness." But even she did not believe her own words. Edwin stirred under the blankets, his skin flushed as though lit from within. The fever hummed through the air like a low, relentless tune. "Missus." Harcourt dipped her cloth into cool water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to her son's brow. Outside, footsteps paused briefly at the door, someone lingering, listening perhaps before hurrying away again. In the silence that followed, the house seemed to sink into itself. By nightfall, the whispers grew bolder. Someone claimed to have seen a Harcourt daughter crying into her apron. Another insisted the doctor had left with a grim face. A few wondered whether the authorities would come next, whether the family would be removed to the isolation hospital on the Thames. Nobody knew. Everyone speculated. And from behind their tight-drawn curtains, they all waited for a sign, any sign, that the crisis might spread. The curtains remained shut. The whispers thickened like the fog. For, in Victorian Britain, a closed curtain did not simply hide a family. It warned the entire street that beneath that roof something was unfolding that no one wished to face, yet everyone feared would soon be their own. Nurse Eleanor Byrne arrived at the Harcourt home just after midnight, her lantern flickering in the relentless London fog. She had been summoned, quietly whispered to by a messenger boy too frightened to step closer than the garden gate. In Whitechapel, a nurse venturing out this late, carrying her satchel and wrapped in a heavy shawl, signalled one thing to anyone who saw her pass. The illness was no longer mild. Her footsteps were soft on the wet pavement, softened further by exhaustion. She had tended to 3 fevered children the night before and sat through 2 agonizing deaths earlier that week. Her eyes burned with sleeplessness, but there was no rest for nurses in times like these. The city was a vast, trembling body, and every hour another door opened to reveal another patient burning from the inside out. The Harcourts met her at the threshold, Mrs. Harcourt, pale and hollow-cheeked, her hands trembling as she guided Eleanor inside. The chalk X glared white beneath the lantern light, as stark as a sentence pronounced by an indifferent judge. Eleanor kept her gaze steady, her expression calm. Panic spread faster than disease, and she refused to be its instrument. Inside, the air was thick with fever heat. It pressed against her skin the moment she stepped into the narrow hallway, warm as breath, heavy as steam. The house smelled of vinegar, camphor, and fear, 3 scents Eleanor knew too intimately to ever forget. She moved toward the rear bedroom where Edwin lay, her hand instinctively tightening around her worn satchel. The room was dim. Only a single candle remained lit, its flame bending as though recoiling from the boy's labored breathing. Edwin's mother hovered nearby, her rosary clutched so tightly that the beads left small dents in her skin. Clara sat in the corner with her doll, too frightened to sleep, too young to understand why everyone whispered now. Eleanor approached the bed. The fever had reddened Edwin's face to an alarming shade. His skin glistened with sweat, and the small rising pustules, those pale, dreadful pearls, were beginning to outline themselves along his hairline and the curve of his jaw. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She had seen this progression before. First heat, then rash, then agony. Smallpox was a cruel storyteller. Its chapters unfolded with grim predictability. She touched his wrist lightly. Hot, far too hot. His pulse raced beneath her fingertips like a trapped bird beating against its cage. She reached for her cloths, cooled in a basin beside the bed, and pressed one gently to his skin. "It will rise tonight," she murmured quietly to Mrs. Harcourt, her voice steady but soft. "The fever always fights hardest in the dark." The mother swallowed, her eyes glossy. "Will he survive it?" Eleanor hesitated only for a second. "But enough. We will do all we can." Through the long hours that followed, Eleanor moved tirelessly. She cooled Edwin's brow, changed his linens, coaxed him to sip water, and soothed his delirious muttering when he slipped in and out of consciousness. She kept the windows cracked despite the cold. The smell of infection needed somewhere to go. The candle burned low. The night stretched on. In the hallway, she heard the faint hush of neighbors shifting behind their own drawn curtains, listening for sounds from the marked house. Even in sleep, or the closest thing to it, fear lingered in every corner of the street. In those rare moments between tending him, Eleanor sat upright in her wooden chair, refusing even to close her eyes. She could not afford a moment's lapse, not tonight. Too many times she had drifted for a breath, only to wake to a child choking on fevered phlegm or thrashing in terror. She had made herself a promise long ago, after losing her own little brother to the pox. She would not sleep while another child suffered if she could help it. The candle finally guttered out. The room sank into a grey hush, illuminated only by the faint glow of Eleanor's lantern. Edwin whimpered, a fragile sound. She leaned forward immediately, her shadow stretching long across the bed. "I'm here," she whispered, brushing damp curls from his forehead. "You're not alone." Mrs. Harcourt watched her, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. To her, Eleanor seemed carved of some quiet, unshakable strength, a figure woven from equal parts resolve and sorrow. She did not know that beneath the shawl and the calm voice, the nurse carried her own scars, her own sleepless nights haunted by memories of fevered children who had slipped through her hands. Morning crept in grey and reluctant. Eleanor still had not slept. She dipped her cloth again, wrung it out, and prepared for another hour of vigil, another day, another chance. For in Victorian Britain, smallpox stole rest long before it stole lives, and nurses like Eleanor Byrne stood awake through every trembling moment, determined to hold the line between fever and finality, as long as their weary bodies would let them. By late morning, the Harcourt parlour had transformed from a room of modest comfort into a chamber steeped in the unmistakable smell of camphor, a sharp, medicinal scent that clung to the curtains, the upholstery, and the very air itself. It was a smell Londoners knew too well. It filled sick rooms like incense in a chapel, lingering long after the afflicted had passed through its shadow. To step into such a room was to step into a confession of fear. Mrs. Harcourt moved through the parlour with slow, deliberate steps, her apron still damp from wiping the boy's fevered skin. She had placed small bowls of camphor-spiked water on every surface, hoping that the fumes might purify the air. It was an old practice, older than the city, older than the very bricks lining Whitechapel Road. Whether it saved lives or simply gave comfort was a matter no one dared question. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, giving off more smoke than warmth. A chill crept into the room despite the flames, curling around the corners like a reminder that winter still pressed its face against the window panes. Mrs. Harcourt pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, then paused to catch her breath, one hand pressed to her ribs. The room felt smaller today, narrower, darker, heavier. From upstairs, Edwin's fevered murmurs drifted down like distant echoes. Each sound pricked her nerves, a needle of dread in her chest. Nurse Eleanor had insisted she rest, but how could she? Rest was a luxury for those who did not have an X on their door. On the mantelpiece stood the family's Bible, its cracked leather cover turned outward, as though watching over the house. Beside it lay a small tin of smelling salts, and a bundle of lavender sprigs tied with twine tokens from a neighbour who did not dare come inside but pressed the items into Clara's hands through the barely opened door. Small gestures of sympathy replaced the visits that would have once been offered freely. In these times, kindness travelled through cracks in the door frame. A soft knock startled the quiet. Mrs. Harcourt froze, heart pounding. No visitors were expected. No visitors were allowed. She approached the door cautiously. When she drew it open just an inch, she found young Henry Whitlow standing on the step, clutching his cap in his hands. His mother, Mrs. Whitlow, hovered several paces behind him, her posture stiff, ready to flee at the slightest sign of contagion. "Mama said to bring this," the boy said, holding out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. His voice quivered with a mix of fear and pride, as though performing an act of courage just by standing so near the marked house. Mrs. Harcourt swallowed hard. "Thank you, Henry. Please, set it down there by the step." He obeyed quickly, placing the parcel on the ground before stepping back. His mother tugged at his sleeve, and together they hurried away without looking back. Inside the parcel she found a small loaf of bread, a pinch of tea leaves, and a note written in an unsteady hand. "For your strength, we are praying for you." The kindness brought tears to her eyes, sharp, unexpected. The parlour blurred. She pressed the note to her chest and closed her eyes until her heartbeat softened. But the quiet did not last. A sudden cry echoed down the stairs, Edwin's voice cracked and frantic. At once the house snapped to life. Mrs. Harcourt rushed to the staircase, skirts brushing against bowls of camphor water, leaving tiny ripples behind her. The smell followed her upward, clinging to her like a shroud. She reached the bedroom to find Nurse Eleanor leaning over Edwin, whose eyes darted wildly beneath half-lowered lids. His fever had climbed again. His voice rose in delirious fragments, names, pleas, the ramblings of a boy caught between fever and fear. Eleanor looked up, her face pale but composed. "It's beginning," she murmured. "The fever is taking hold." Mrs. Harcourt took her son's hand, feeling the heat radiating through his skin. His pulse trembled beneath her fingertips. The parlour below felt like another world entirely too clean, too still. "I can fetch more water," she whispered. "No," Eleanor replied softly, smoothing the boy's hair. "Stay with him. He knows your voice." So Mrs. Harcourt sat, her fingers intertwined with her son's, while the camphor fumes drifted up from below, mingling with the scent of sweat and fever. The house seemed to pulse in rhythm with Edwin's ragged breaths. Downstairs, the parlour stood waiting, bowls steaming gently, fire crackling, shadows swaying like quiet witnesses. The room smelled of camphor and fear and desperate hope, and as the day wore on, the scent only grew stronger. For in Victorian Britain, every sickroom became a battleground, and every parlour smelled faintly of remedies meant as much for courage as for cure. Before the sun had any chance to rise over London, another cart creaked down Whitechapel Road, its wooden wheels groaning under the burden of purpose rather than weight. Dawn had not yet broken. The sky remained an ink-washed sheet of blue-black, smeared with coal smoke and a thin sliver of dying moon. Only the lantern swinging from the cart's iron hook gave shape to the figure guiding it. A thin man in a wool cap pulled low, face hidden in the shifting halo of dim yellow light. Everyone knew this cart. Everyone pretended not to. It rattled along the cobblestones with the steady, unhurried rhythm of inevitability. The man leading it, Mr. Tavers, the undertaker's assistant, moved like someone accustomed to travelling roads no one else wished to see. He walked with shoulders slightly hunched, as though bearing invisible weight, long before he reached any doorstep. In his hands, he gripped the reins loosely, more a guide than a driver, for both he and the horse understood their route well. Victorian London had no shortage of calls for the dead, but today he arrived earlier than usual. The quiet before dawn was his ally. People were less likely to watch from windows, less likely to ask questions, less likely to notice the cart stopping at a particular door. Shame and death had learned to share the same hour. The city's first light had become the time for removing bodies, so families might preserve a shred of dignity. As the cart rolled closer to the Harcourt home, the smell of camphor drifted faintly into the street. Mr. Tavers smelled it before he saw the chalk X. The bitter scent curled into the cold air like a warning. He tugged the reins and slowed the horse. His lantern cast a trembling glow across the marked door. The X looked sharp, freshly drawn, its lines still bright against the splintered wood. A recent mark. A new mark. He sighed, nearly inaudibly. Smallpox again. He had gathered too many bodies these past weeks, each one thinner and lighter than the last, as though the fever had burned not just life but weight from them. He stepped down from the cart and stood for a moment, listening. Silence. Not the comfortable hush of sleeping families, but a heavier silence, one that seemed to throb with breath held too long. It seeped from behind closed curtains, lingered in the gaps beneath doorframes, and hovered on porches like frost reluctant to melt. He did not knock. He never knocked at houses with new chalk marks. He simply waited. If someone had died during the night, they would appear at the door with a sheet-draped burden by the time the sky paled. But today, the Harcourt door remained closed. Tavers glanced up and down the street, scanning windows for the shift of a curtain, the silhouette of a watcher. Nothing. Even the fog seemed to recoil from his presence. He waited a minute more out of respect, out of habit. Still nothing. Not tonight, then. Not this house. Not yet. Relief was a strange thing on these streets. It arrived in small, fragile waves, never loud, never triumphant. Mr. Tavers felt only a faint easing of tension in his shoulders as he turned back toward the cart. The horse stamped softly, its breath pooling white in the cold. He climbed up, settled onto the seat, and clicked the reins lightly. The cart moved on. Behind him, the Harcourt house remained dim, its windows dark except for a thin strip of lamplight flickering behind the upstairs drapes. Inside, Edwin fought his fever. His mother held his hand. Nurse Eleanor refused sleep yet again. The smallpox had not claimed him, but neither had it relented. The danger was thickening, hour by hour. As the cart continued down the street, it passed houses where mothers stirred in their beds, waking with a jolt and listening for the creak of wheels. It passed homes where children pretended to sleep, terrified their door might be next. It passed alleys where stray cats darted from shadows, fleeing the cold or the cart or both. Before dawn, the city lived in fear of that sound. By the time the sun's first pale light seeped between the chimneys, the cart had vanished into the waking haze, its traces swallowed by the day. And though it had not stopped for the Harcourts, its passing reminded every person on the street of one simple, dreadful truth. The cart would return. It always returned. And for families marked by the chalk X, each dawn was a question whispered into the fog. Will today be the day it stops at our door? The apothecary on Hanbury Street stood like a quiet sentinel beneath the fog, its windows coated in a fine layer of frost that blurred the rows of bottles inside into soft silhouettes, pale shapes, suspended in amber, ruby, and dark green glass. By morning light, the shop appeared almost inviting, glowing faintly like a lantern in a winter storm. But today, as Mrs. Harcourt approached with her shawl wrapped tightly around her, the glow felt different, dimmer, more hesitant, as though the building itself sensed what news she carried. She paused before the door, her breath trembling in the cold. From inside came the muted clink of glass and the rustle of paper sachets being folded. The apothecary, Mr. Fenwick, was awake early, as always. He lived above the shop, surrounded by the perfumes and poisons of his trade. But he was also a man whose hands had grown unsteady over the years, not from age, but from witnessing too many families fight battles he could not help them win. Mrs. Harcourt pushed open the door. A bell chimed overhead, soft, melancholy, like the toll of a distant church far across the river. Mrs. Harcourt, Mr. Fenwick greeted her, stepping forward with a careful courtesy. He took one look at her face and lowered his voice. How fares the boy? Her hands tightened around the edges of her shawl. The fever rises. The nurse says it may worsen by nightfall. The spots? He asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. Mr. Fenwick inhaled slowly, the lines around his mouth deepening. Without another word, he retreated behind the counter and began selecting bottles from the shelf, each with labels faded by time: camphor spirits, fever salts, laudanum, elderflower tonic. Remedies, Victorian London swore by, though none could halt the march of smallpox. Still, people clung to these mixtures as if the right combination of herbs and courage might turn the tide. As he worked, Mrs. Harcourt let her gaze drift across the shop. The frost on the window blurred the view of the street like breath on a mirror. Outside, passers-by walked quickly, their shoulders hunched against both cold and rumour. No one wished to linger near the Harcourt home. Even fewer wished to stand near someone who might be returning from it. Inside the shop, the air carried a heady blend of scents: lavender, anise, turpentine, cloves, and the sharp sting of disinfecting spirits. Rows of drawers lined the walls, each labelled in elegant cursive: aconite, quince seeds, mercurial ointment, asafoetida. Behind the counter lay even stronger concoctions, those whispered about rather than sold, those administered only when desperation outweighed caution. Mr. Fenwick arranged the selected bottles neatly on a square of brown paper. "These may ease his discomfort," he murmured. "They won't cure him, but they will soften the hours." Softening the hours. The phrase fell upon her like a blow. She steadied herself on the counter, swallowing hard. Behind her, the bell above the door jingled faintly as a young woman peeked inside, only to freeze when she saw who stood at the counter. Colour drained from her face. She stepped back, muttered an apology, and pulled the door closed again. The bell's chime faded like a sigh. Shame crept up Mrs. Harcourt's throat, warm and stinging. She felt suddenly small beneath the apothecary's dim lamplight, like a shadow that had wandered into the wrong room. Mr. Fenwick said nothing of the woman's retreat. Instead, he folded the paper parcel carefully and tied it with twine. "You must not let the boy scratch," he advised gently. "It worsens the scarring. Keep cloths cool, but not cold. And be patient with the delirium. It will sharpen before it fades." "If it fades," she whispered. His eyes flickered downward. "Yes, if—" He placed the parcel into her hands with a solemn bow of his head. She thanked him, though her voice quavered. As she turned to leave, the frosted glass door shuddered slightly in the wind. Outside, the fog had thickened into a pale shroud, swallowing the street in soft whiteness. She stepped into it and felt the cold seep instantly through her shawl. The parcel felt heavier than it should have weighted, not with medicines but with fear, with duty, with the unspoken question every mother carried when smallpox entered her home. Behind her, inside the apothecary, Mr. Fenwick exhaled into the stillness. Another family, another child, another set of remedies that would soothe but not save. He closed the ledger slowly, listening to the fading sound of her footsteps. And in the frost-blurred glow of his shop, he whispered a prayer that smelled faintly of camphor and sorrow, one he'd spoken countless times before, knowing full well that London did not always listen. Dr. Avery sat alone at his writing desk as the evening fog thickened outside his window, turning the street into a shifting grey corridor where gas lamps glowed like half-remembered stars. He should have been resting. He had been awake for nearly 30 hours, but rest refused him. It hovered just beyond reach, taunting, insistent, impossible. His hands shook too much for sleep, and his thoughts pressed too heavily for peace. Across the desk lay his medical ledger, its pages speckled with ink stains and the hurried script of countless diagnoses. The newest entry, written only an hour before, haunted him still. Edwin Harcourt, fever worsening, lesions emerging, prognosis uncertain. He had stared at the words for so long that the ink seemed to bleed into the page, darkening, spreading, consuming. He closed the book. His fingers lingered on the leather cover, those same fingers that had pressed against so many fevered foreheads, lifted so many trembling wrists, closed so many lifeless eyes. They were capable hands, or so people believed. They brought comfort, or the illusion of it. But in recent years, Avery had begun to fear them. What good were hands that could diagnose but could not cure, touch but could not heal? Hands that carried knowledge but no power? He looked down at them now, resting upon the table like two pale, traitorous things. They bore faint traces of tinctures and disinfectant, scents that clung even after washing the perfume of helplessness. He flexed them slowly, watching the tendons shift beneath his skin. Smallpox lingered on surfaces, clothing, linens, on anything touched by the infected. And though he scrubbed his hands raw after each visit, he knew the truth whispered in medical circles. Sometimes even the cleanest hands carried doom. He had seen it happen before. A physician in Limehouse, a dear friend, contracted the disease after treating a dozen afflicted children. He lasted 5 days. A midwife on Crispin Street fell ill after delivering a child whose mother hid her symptoms until it was too late. She died within a week. Avery feared the moment when he, too, might feel that first unnatural warmth beneath the collar. The idea stalked him, appearing in the quiet hours when the city held its breath. Many nights he awoke, convinced he felt fever rising in his veins, only to discover it was his mind playing cruel tricks. Tonight, those fears slithered back with renewed purpose. Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels hissing through the fog. Footsteps echoed faintly, then faded into silence. Avery leaned back in his chair, pressing a trembling hand against his brow. He had not eaten since yesterday. Hunger felt trivial now, drowned out by the weight of what he carried. He remembered the Harcourt boy's eyes, glazed, searching, terrified, the heat rolling off him in waves, the mother's whisper thin, cracking, "Will he survive it?" He had lied. He always lied. It was a doctor's duty to lie if truth offered no comfort. A sudden knock at the door jolted him upright. He hesitated, staring at the knob as if it might turn on its own. Visitors at this hour rarely brought good news. Slowly, he rose and opened the door to reveal Mrs. Bates, an elderly widow from 3 streets over. Her face was blotched with panic. Her shawl hung lopsided from hurried hands. "Doctor, oh doctor, it's my grandson," she gasped. "He's taken ill, terrible ill. The fever came on so quickly." Avery felt his heartbeat pause, then resume with steady resignation. Another child, another home, another night with his polished bag and trembling hands. "I'll come at once," he said gently, though exhaustion clawed at his bones. He retrieved the bag from its place by the door. Its weight settled into his palm with familiar coldness. He glanced once more at his hands, his instruments of mercy, his instruments of failure. "You must keep him strong," Mrs. Bates pleaded, as they stepped into the fog. Avery swallowed. "I will try." Outside, the fog swallowed them whole as they walked. The doctor's breath mingled with the night, drifting like a fragile promise in the dark. His hands, hidden within his gloves, felt no less treacherous. For in Victorian Britain, physicians were both guardians and ghosts, moving from house to house, carrying hope in one pocket and despair in the other. And every time Dr. Avery lifted his hand to knock upon another door, he wondered if this would be the visit that marked his own. By the 3rd day of Edwin's fever, the Harcourt home had begun to fold in on itself like a wounded creature, shrinking under the weight of dread and isolation. Outside, life stumbled onward. Vendors called out muffled greetings, horses clattered down the street, and children whispered behind gloved hands. But the Harcourt door, once painted a cheerful blue, now stood like a sealed tomb beneath the chalk X, refusing to open for anyone, refusing even to breathe. It was not locked. It did not need to be. Fear served as the bolt. Neighbors had stopped knocking the moment the chalk dried. No one brought broth, no one offered to sweep the steps or check on the children. Even the milkman, who prided himself on delivering through blizzard, rain, or riot, left their jug 2 houses away in embarrassed haste. From behind their curtains, the street watched the Harcourt home with the reverence one might afford a sleeping monster. Inside, time thickened. The house felt darker, though the lamps were lit from morning until night. Shadows lingered too long in corners. Even the air grew stale, heavy with the scent of fever, boiled water, and the unspoken truth that the illness was no longer a visitor, it had become a resident. The floors creaked with unease. The windows fogged with every breath. Silence pressed against the walls until they seemed to sag beneath its weight. Mrs. Harcourt tried to maintain the rhythm of an ordinary day, brewing tea, tending the fire, setting plates on the table, but the rituals felt hollow, like mimicking life in a house that had stepped just slightly outside of time. Clara followed her mother quietly, her doll dragging behind her on a frayed string. She had stopped asking if Edwin would get better. Children sensed these things long before adults admitted them. Upstairs, Edwin's delirium worsened. His skin burned beneath the cool cloths. His breaths came in shallow gasps, and the pustules, once faint, had blossomed fully across his face, neck, and torso. The sight tore at Mrs. Harcourt's soul. Her boy, once all laughter and mischief, now lay unrecognizable beneath the swelling marks, like a child swallowed by a cruel dream. Nurse Eleanor remained at his side with quiet devotion, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She coaxed him to drink, soothed his fevered ramblings, and watched the rhythm of his breaths with the vigilance of someone who knew too well what signs to fear. By afternoon, the fever surged. Edwin thrashed, crying out for his father, for water, for mercy. He clawed at his sheets with shaking hands. Eleanor held him gently, whispering assurances, though she knew he could not hear them. Downstairs, the front door shuddered slightly, but only from a gust of wind. Mrs. Harcourt froze mid-step, listening. For a heartbeat, she imagined opening the door to fresh air, to familiar faces, to the world beyond the suffocating walls. But the moment passed, the handle remained untouched. No visitor waited on the other side. The door, once a portal to markets, neighbors, and Sunday walks, had become a barrier stronger than any lock. When evening arrived, the fog outside thickened until it looked like the street itself had vanished. Dr. Avery was late. He had been summoned twice since morning to other homes. Mrs. Harcourt paced the parlor in restless circles, her shawl clutched tightly around her. Each creak of the floorboards made her turn toward the door in hope that felt thinner each time it died. But the door did not open. Dr. Avery finally arrived near midnight. He approached quietly, lantern in hand, his polished bag swinging at his side like a harbinger. He knocked once, softly, respectfully. The sound echoed through the house like a memory of normal life. Mrs. Harcourt rushed to unlatch the door, and for the first time in days, the door cracked open. But it opened only enough to admit the doctor. Behind him, the fog curled eagerly toward the threshold, as though trying to slip inside. Mrs. Harcourt closed the door quickly, sealing the sickness in and the world out once more. Avery ascended the stairs with slow, heavy steps, aware that each visit tightened the rope around the boy's fate. When he entered the room, Nurse Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that told the truth before her lips formed the words. "He's weakening," she whispered. Avery approached Edwin's bedside and saw it immediately, the dullness in the boy's eyes, the irregular rise and fall of his chest, the way his body seemed to shrink beneath the weight of fever. Smallpox had crept close to its conclusion. Downstairs, the closed door stood silent and stern, a sentry between the Harcourt family and the world that no longer dared to cross their threshold. And, for the first time since the chalk mark appeared, Mrs. Harcourt understood the full cruelty of a house that people feared to enter. It was not the door that would not open. It was the world that refused to let them step out. By the time Edwin Harcourt's fever reached its 4th day, the entire length of Whitechapel Road had begun to change. What had once been a bustling stretch of traders, rag-pickers, costermongers, chimney sweeps, and barefoot children became a corridor of careful footsteps and suspicious glances. It happened slowly at first, a hesitation here, a detour there, but within a week, the change settled over the street like a funeral cloth. People no longer walked past the Harcourt house. They walked around it. A subtle arc formed in the foot traffic, like water parting around a stone dropped into a stream. Even those with urgent business approached the marked home with wide eyes and a widened berth, their shoulders tensing as they passed its windows. Mothers crossed to the opposite pavement with their children still in tow, pulling them close whenever they tried to look back. Men carrying crates or invoices hurried their steps, pretending they did not notice the chalk X gleaming like a wound on the Harcourt door. No one said it aloud, but the air carried the message clearly enough. That house had become the center of a quiet orbit, one of fear rather than gravity. On foggy mornings, when sounds were muted and footsteps softened by damp, the street felt strangely hollow. Even the vendors' voices seemed subdued, as if to raise them too high might awaken whatever spectre lurked behind the Harcourt curtains. The coalman, usually the loudest figure on the road, now dropped his sacks with remarkable gentleness, his boots barely clicking along the stones. The postboy slid letters into door slots without lingering. The butcher's boy wrapped his scarf over his nose as he passed, though he'd never admit why. And then there were the children. They gathered at corners, clutching marbles or worn leather balls, whispering behind cupped hands. Their eyes flicked constantly toward the marked house. "Do you think the boy's dead? My mum says no one gets up once the spots come. Maybe the nurse inside died too. No, she's the bravest woman in London. What if the sickness creeps out the windows?" Their games shifted accordingly. No more hopscotch squares drawn near the Harcourt gate, no more hide-and-seek in the alley beside it. Instead, they invented new rules, new boundaries, based on the disease they scarcely understood, but feared instinctively. One popular game involved daring each other to run as close as possible to the Harcourt fence and back, touching the wood only with the tip of a shoe. Whoever managed the fastest earned bragging rights, though afterwards each child inspected their boot nervously, as if expecting spots to appear there too. Inside the house, the Harcourts felt this avoidance more acutely than any insult. It was not merely that visitors stopped coming, it was the silence, the absence of footsteps, the way the world shifted itself so carefully to avoid touching them at all. Mrs. Harcourt stood by the upstairs window more often now. She did not pry the curtains open fully, only enough to let in a sliver of daylight. Through the narrow gap, she watched the shapes moving below her, neighbors carrying baskets, boys rolling barrels, women shaking out linens but never facing her door, never pausing, never glancing upward. She pressed her fingers against the glass. The pane felt cold, as though the outside world had grown a layer of frost she could never thaw. For a fleeting moment she wondered if they had become ghosts, if the street had quietly declared them already dead. In the back room, Nurse Eleanor wrapped fresh cloths for Edwin, humming softly under her breath, a tune with no melody, only comfort. She noticed the mother's distant stare and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They avoid because they fear," she murmured, "not because they judge." But Mrs. Harcourt shook her head. Fear is its own judgment. That afternoon, Dr. Avery arrived with a new vial of tincture. He approached from the opposite end of the street, and even he felt the strange emptiness around the Harcourt home, the absence of life, the widening space. He moved through it like a man entering a clearing in the woods, where something dangerous waited. He paused beside the chalk X, exhaled, and knocked. All along the road, curtains shifted, silhouettes appeared, then vanished. People watched, breath held, as if expecting him to emerge with grim news. When the door opened and swallowed him whole, the street seemed to hold even stiller. By nightfall, a hush settled over the neighborhood, deeper than before. Lamps flickered behind fogged windows, doors locked early. Not a soul passed the Harcourt home after dark, not even the stray tomcat who used to slink along the garden wall. It was as though the sickness had stretched its shadow outward, claiming not just the house, but the street around it. A quiet, invisible quarantine imposed by fear, not by order. For in Victorian Britain, smallpox did not simply sicken the body. It hollowed neighbourhoods, reshaped streets, and carved silence into places once full of life. And Whitechapel Road, in its uneasy avoidance, began to look less like a community, and more like a map with a single forbidden point at its centre. The Morning Post arrived late on the day Edwin's fever darkened. Not because the postman had overslept, he was punctual by nature and necessity, but because he lingered at the edge of Whitechapel Road, sorting letters twice, thrice, as though any error in the route might condemn him to the same fate as those behind the chalk-marked doors. His satchel bulged with envelopes sealed in red wax, tied with twine, smudged with fingerprints. Some bore the imprint of distant towns, others the familiar scrawl of neighbouring streets. But a handful, thin, tremulous, and always addressed in the same hurried script, were the letters nobody wanted to receive. They announced exposure. They announced danger. They announced fate. When the postman reached the Harcourt house, he hesitated. He knew he must not knock. The rules forbade it. Instead, he slid their letters through the narrow gap beneath the door, careful not to touch the handle, careful not to breathe too deeply as he stooped before the chalk X. The envelopes crossed the threshold like pale birds, settling softly upon the worn entry rug. Upstairs, Mrs. Harcourt heard the faint scrape and thud of paper hitting the floor. Her stomach tightened. These days, letters were as dangerous as symptoms. They carried truth, stark and unsoftened, written in ink with no regard for the fragility of human fear. She descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The hallway felt colder than usual, the air more stagnant. When she bent to gather the envelopes, her hands trembled. 3 letters, one from the parish office, one from her married sister in Camden Town, and one thin, almost weightless from the school board. She opened the parish letter first. It has come to our attention that illness has been reported within your household. Out of concern for the neighbourhood's welfare, we advise remaining indoors and refraining from accepting visitors. As though she needed the warning, as though anyone dared visit, she set it aside and tore open the second. Her sister wrote in anxious haste, "I heard whispers, but no one knows the truth. Please write at once. Has it reached your boy? Is there danger for the girls? Oh, Mary, do not keep us in the dark." The words blurred before she reached the end. Her sister's fear was palpable, tinged with sorrow, but also with something colder, a need to know whether she should keep her own children far, far away. Finally, she opened the school board's letter. "Your son, Edwin, has been absent for 4 consecutive days, with no formal notice. As sickness is reported in the district, we must confirm whether he has contracted any dangerous ailment." A dangerous ailment, as if one might confuse smallpox with a common cold. She sank into the hallway chair, all 3 letters trembling in her lap. A fierce loneliness swept through her, a loneliness deeper than isolation. The letters made it real. They confirmed the unspoken. The world outside her home did not merely worry for her family. It had begun to distance itself. From upstairs drifted the sound of Nurse Eleanor humming faintly, soothing Edwin through the fevered confusion of the pustular stage. The boy's cries had softened into weak murmurs, but his breathing came in uneven waves. The disease had him in its grip now, squeezing tighter with every hour. Mrs. Harcourt pressed the letters to her chest. Their edges cut faint lines into her skin, a small, tangible pain compared to the one tightening in her throat. The postman continued down the street, delivering warnings, condolences, and unspoken accusations to anyone deemed close enough to the Harcourts to warrant caution. Some households received 2 letters, some none. A few neighbors snatched theirs quickly and shut the door before the postman even moved on. One woman, Mrs. Finch, opened hers at once. Exposure confirmed near your residence. Monitor all members of your household. Seek immediate medical aid if fever develops. She clutched the paper, her breath stuttering. Immediately, she called her daughter inside, shuttering the windows as though the words themselves carried contagion. By midday, the entire street buzzed, not with trade or laughter, but with the crackle of fear awakened by sealed envelopes. Letters passed hand to hand like relics from a forbidden place. Families gathered around lamplit tables to read them aloud in hushed tones, eyes darting toward the Harcourt home with mingled pity and terror. But in the Harcourt hallway, Mrs. Harcourt folded the letters carefully and placed them atop the mantel, as though organizing grief into neat stacks might lessen its weight. She knew she would write replies. She knew she must, but not yet. Not while Edwin's breaths faltered upstairs. Not while the house felt held in a kind of dim suspension between 2 worlds. For in Victorian Britain, letters were lifelines carrying news, comfort, warning, and dread. But sometimes they were also tombstones delivered early. And on Whitechapel Road, the letters nobody wanted to receive had begun to arrive in earnest. At St. Brigid's Primary on the corner of Hanbury and Fieldgate, the school bell rang with its usual thin, metallic cry, yet the sound did not bring the flurry of laughter and boots that it once had. The children filed into the dim classroom with unusual quiet, their breath visible in the morning chill, their small shoes barely tapping against the scuffed floorboards. Something was wrong, though none of them dared say it aloud. The desks told the story. 3 of them stood empty in the front row, their chairs tucked neatly beneath them, their slates wiped clean, their inkwells filled but untouched. A strange, breathless emptiness hovered around those seats, an absence so loud it silenced even the boldest whisper. Miss Turnley, the schoolmistress, noticed the hush instantly. She was a thin woman with anxious eyes, her hair pinned back so tightly it seemed to hold her upright. Usually she began the day with a firm greeting, her voice like a crisp sheet snapped into place. But that morning, when she glanced toward the missing pupils, her words faltered. "Settle your books," she said softly. "We shall begin with arithmetic." Her tone lacked its usual steel. A paper-thin tremor threaded through it. She moved between the rows, adjusting collars, collecting homework, her eyes flickering again and again toward the empty desks, as though expecting someone to appear in them late, breathless, apologetic. But they would not appear. The students knew why. Smallpox had taken George Dempsey's little sister last week. Annie Whitlow had been kept home under strict orders after her brother developed a fever. And now Edwin Harcourt, his desk in the front corner, worn smooth by his restless elbows, sat empty, as though it had never belonged to anyone at all. A few children glanced at that desk, then quickly looked away. It was considered poor luck to stare at the seat of an absent child. Poor luck, poor manners, and perhaps even dangerous. In children's minds, empty desks were not furniture, they were warnings. Miss Turnley tried to continue. She chalked sums onto the board, but each stroke came slower than the last. Her hand twitched. The chalk snapped. The children jumped. She dropped the fragments into the waste bin with a sharp breath. Arithmetic dissolved into a quiet reading lesson. Then reading dissolved into hushed copying. Even the youngest pupils sensed the undercurrent. The school itself was holding its breath. Outside, the playground sat unused, its ropes swaying gently in the cold wind. Teachers from other rooms gathered near the doorway in anxious clustering, their voices low. 3 from this street alone. Whitechapel's been hit worse, they say. They should shut us down before it spreads. My cousin's boy died in 2 days. 2 days, imagine it. Do you think it came from the Harcourt child? Miss Turnley heard every whisper, though none were meant for her. the guilt pressed on her chest like a stone. She had taught Edwin since he was 6. He had been a lively, troublesome boy with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that burst from him like a cracked bell. To think of him now, fighting for breath, made her throat tighten until speech became a fragile, breakable thing. When the midday break arrived, the children did not race into the yard. Instead, they clustered in doorways, watching the street as though the sickness might be visible. A shape moving through fog, a shadow slipping across the cobblestones. Little Charlotte Finch tugged Miss Turnley's sleeve. "Miss, will Edwin come back to school?" The teacher knelt beside her, smoothing the child's hair with trembling fingers. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "I hope so," she managed. But Charlotte frowned. "Mama says when a desk stays empty too long, it means God has decided the child is needed elsewhere." Miss Turnley felt something cold settle in her. "Your mother should not frighten you with such ideas." "But is it true?" She looked toward Edwin's desk, the slate clean, the ink dry, the seat small and waiting, and her voice felt like someone else's when she replied, "No, child, not always." Yet her eyes stung. The day limped on. Lessons blurred. Children coughed nervously into their sleeves, and each cough made the others flinch. By the final bell, the room felt hollow, as though part of its light had dimmed. One by one, the children left. Miss Turnley remained behind, tidying the desks as she always did. When she reached Edwin's seat, her hands hovered over the wood. She straightened his books, though they were already straight. She dusted his slate, though no dust lay there. Finally, she placed a small dandelion on the corner plucked from the yard by some hopeful child earlier that morning. The flower looked out of place in the cold room, like a hesitant promise. Miss Turnley stepped back, her breath trembling in the stillness. In Victorian Britain, empty desks spoke louder than morning bells. They told stories before anyone dared to tell them. And on this pale, fog-chilled morning in Whitechapel, the schoolroom had begun its quiet vigil. 3 empty desks, 3 stories unfolding beyond the walls, and one teacher praying the 4th would not soon stand empty too. In a cramped, dimly lit room above a shop on Hanbury Street, Miss Agnes Latham bent over her sewing frame, the lamplight catching on the small beads of sweat forming along her brow. Her fingers moved deftly, threading silk through fabric, stitching hem after hem for a wealthy client who would never enter this neighborhood. Yet, despite the monotony of the work, Agnes could not ignore the peculiar warmth that had crept over her wrist that morning. A single, faintly pink blemish, round and deliberate, as if painted by some unseen hand. She paused mid-stitch and pressed her fingertips lightly to the spot. Heat radiated back, her breath caught. The sensation was familiar, too familiar. Agnes had read about it in the newspapers, heard whispered accounts from neighbors, and seen the pallor that followed on the faces of children in the street below. She knew the signs. A smallpox mark revealed itself first in delicate whispers on the skin, then unfurled across the body in quiet, inexorable horror. Her heart quickened. The hum of the street outside had not yet begun. Carts rolled silently past the windows, and the occasional child's cough echoed up the narrow lane. Yet inside, time seemed suspended, each second pressing against her like the hot weight of fever. She considered fetching water or camphor, but the remedies of the day offered only fragile hope. They would not stop the disease at best. They could comfort, they could delay, they could soften. The sewing frame clattered as she set it aside, and she rose slowly, pacing the small room. Each step seemed to echo against the plaster walls. Agnes felt the eyes of her neighbors upon her, though she had seen none. In Whitechapel, the awareness of illness spread faster than the disease itself. Rumors traveled from curtained windows and shop doors, carried in the gaslit fog, whispered from mother to mother, from child to child, until a single tiny mark could name a household and condemn it to isolation, before the fever had taken hold. Her gaze fell on the mirror across the room. She held her wrist up, turning it this way and that, examining the pink spot. It was tiny, almost innocent, yet it seemed to pulse with an urgency she could not ignore. Panic mingled with determination. She would not cry. She would not faint. There were others who depended on her, for orders to be delivered, for garments to be finished, for small domestic miracles in a world shrinking beneath the threat of contagion. But still, the mark stared back, accusing and inevitable. The door creaked, and Agnes froze. A shadow passed beneath the frosted glass above the threshold. Perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a boy sent to fetch water. Perhaps she dared not think it was someone coming to confirm the dread she already felt. The mark on her wrist throbbed again. The room's lamplight seemed dimmer, colder. She clutched her shawl around her shoulders and pressed her fingers to the blemish once more. Her mind raced. She would have to inform someone. Dr. Avery or any physician who could be summoned quietly before the spot multiplied, before it crept over her arm, her face, her body. She thought of the Harcourt boy, of the empty desks at school, of families that no longer dared cross the street. The knowledge of smallpox's cruelty pressed on her like the suffocating fog outside, dense, persistent, and unforgiving. She wrapped her wrist in a clean handkerchief, as carefully as she could, and gathered her things. Each movement felt laden with significance. The simple act of leaving the room now was no longer mundane. It was a journey fraught with peril. Each door she opened could invite judgment, suspicion, or the disease itself. Every step toward the street required courage, measured and deliberate. As Agnes descended the narrow stairs, the soft creak of each step seemed amplified. Outside, the gas lamps swayed, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. She adjusted her shawl, concealed her hands, and walked toward the street with deliberate composure. The fog swallowed her figure, folding her into the city's grey breath. Behind her, the little room remained still, its sewing frame empty, its lamp flickering quietly, as if holding its own vigil over the seamstress who had glimpsed the mark that might change everything. In Victorian London, a single spot on a wrist could alter the course of days, the rhythm of households, and the pulse of the street itself. And for Agnes Latham, the workday had ended, though the labour of vigilance had only just begun. The hospital on Whitechapel Road was never quiet. Its corridors held a murmur of suffering that ran beneath every door, echoed in every step along the worn floorboards, and lingered like a cold draught in the corners of each room. But today, the sound of groans, coughing, and the shuffle of nurses' feet seemed heavier, more oppressive than usual. Smallpox had claimed yet another household, and the ward, already crowded with the city's poor and weary, stretched thin under the weight of human fever. Nurse Eleanor Byrne moved quickly between the beds, her skirts brushing against the floor, her hands steady despite the stench of sweat and medicinal spirits that clung to everything. The children lay in narrow cots, their faces mottled and eyes glassy, some whispering names of parents who would never visit them, others murmuring incoherent fragments of dreams or fevered fears. Each cot felt like a universe unto itself, isolated yet interconnected through the ward's oppressive air. The walls were pale, though not entirely clean. Soap had been applied, but not often enough, and disinfectants only masked the scent of infection for a short while. Faint stains darkened the woodwork. Faded curtains, once bright white, hung limp and sallow between beds, providing only a fragile sense of privacy. The smell of vinegar, camphor, and sweat hung thickly, mingling with the faint, metallic scent that clung to the bodies of the afflicted. Nurses moved like shadows through it, whispering encouragements, murmuring instructions, offering cold compresses or spoonfuls of water. A small boy in the far corner, no older than Edwin, whimpered as a high fever rolled over him. Eleanor knelt beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. his tiny fingers curled over hers in a grip both feeble and desperate. The child's breath came in ragged gasps, the faint rattle in his chest a warning to any who listened. She murmured softly, speaking his name like a spell against death itself. The ward was lined with narrow shelves, each holding glass jars filled with powders, herbs, and tinctures. Their labels were faded, written in cursive that once seemed elegant, but now appeared almost mocking. Camphor, laudanum, elderflower, mercury ointments, all remedies that promised relief, but never full salvation. Dr. Avery had insisted on doubling doses for some, halving them for others, leaving Eleanor to administer them carefully, balancing hope against the inevitability of the disease's path. The nurses spoke in hushed tones, communicating silently about which child required immediate attention, which had shown the first signs of pockmarks forming. Whispers of names travelled along the line of beds, urgent and tentative: Harcourt, Dempsey, Latham, Finch. Every name carried with it an invisible weight, a story of family, poverty, and despair pressed into the narrow cot. Beyond the ward, the fog of London pressed against the windows, muffling the world outside. Gas lamps along the street flickered in rhythm with the wind, their dim light reflecting on the wet cobblestones. No child ran through the street, no mother hurried with a basket. The hospital seemed the only pulse of life, the only breath of human concern, and yet its walls trembled under the cumulative sorrow. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion settled over the nurses like a second, heavier layer of air. Eleanor paused to adjust a blanket, pressing her own cheek briefly against the thin wool. She smelled fever, saw tears unbidden, and felt the weight of countless families relying on her vigilance. Even the youngest children seemed aware of the shadow cast over them. They shivered not from cold alone, but from an instinctive dread of what awaited if the fever rose too high, or the pustules spread too fast. A bell rang faintly in the distance, and Eleanor glanced toward the corridor. Dr. Avery would soon arrive, walking cautiously through the ward, his polished bag at his side, ready to confront the relentless march of smallpox with tools both potent and inadequate. For now, she remained kneeling beside the boy in the corner, whispering assurances he could not fully understand, watching the shadows of the ward lengthen in the dying light. In Victorian London, a hospital ward was more than a place of care. It was a threshold between life and death, a repository for grief and hope, a room where fear itself seemed tangible. And in the ragged ward on Whitechapel Road, smallpox claimed its audience every day, leaving the nurses to tend to its victims with hands that shook and hearts that trembled, bound by duty and haunted by the knowledge that no remedy could truly conquer the unseen spectre that moved from cot to cot, room to room, house to house. The corridors of St. Brigid's Hospital carried a smell that clung to clothing, to hair, and even to the skin of those who entered. A pungent, acidic aroma of vinegar, mixed with the bitter tang of disinfectants and the underlying, ever-present odour of sickness. It was a scent that declared itself before the eyes could confirm the horror within. One inhale and the mind shivered, conjuring images of pallid faces, fevered murmurs, and the creeping pustules that had claimed so many of London's children. Nurse Eleanor Byrne moved through the ward with measured steps, her nose pinched against the sharpness, her eyes constantly flicking over the line of beds. Each patient emitted their own small personal scent of disease, warm, damp, slightly sweet, in a way that made the stomach churn. She had learned to recognize them by smell alone, the faint, rising tang that distinguished one child's fever from another's, the difference between a cough born of exhaustion and one born of smallpox. In these dim, fogged rooms, the sense of smell was as valuable as sight, perhaps more so, for the eyes could be deceived by shadows and curtains, but the nose could not lie. The ward was quiet, except for the soft murmurs of children too weak to cry, the shuffling of nurses' skirts along the floor, and the occasional rattle of a tray as Eleanor set down a bowl of water at the bedside of a boy whose lips had already begun to blister with fever. A thin sheet of fog pressed against the windows from the street outside, carrying with it the distant clatter of carts, the bark of a dog, and the muffled voices of pedestrians. All mundane sounds that seemed impossibly far away from the oppressive reality inside. Agnes Latham, the seamstress, now a patient, lay curled beneath a threadbare blanket, her smallpox pustules forming in delicate, cruel patterns along her arms. Eleanor dabbed her forehead with a damp cloth, the vinegar-laced scent clinging to both of them. Agnes flinched at the smell, instinctively recoiling, though she had grown used to it over the last 2 days. Fear and illness combined to make every ordinary sensation, touch, smell, sound sharp, tangible, a warning of what was to come. The nurse moved to Edwin Harcourt's cot, where his mother had settled beside him in silence, her eyes glassy, fingers interlaced tightly over his wrist. The boy's fever had climbed again. His breaths came in short, uneven bursts, punctuated by a faint, rasping cough. Eleanor leaned closer, whispering his name in a soft, steady tone, pressing the damp cloth once more to his burning skin. The smell of vinegar rose, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the sweet, acrid perfume of fevered flesh. It was a scent that brought tears, unbidden to the eyes of even the most hardened nurses, a reminder that life here was always precarious, always under siege. Outside, the fog thickened, curling along the streets like a living thing. Inside, the ward seemed to shrink under the combined weight of smell and silence. The children stirred weakly, some moaning softly, others lying still, their eyes half closed, faces pale beneath the dim light of the lamps. Eleanor moved between them, whispering reassurance where she could, holding hands, adjusting blankets, offering water. Each motion carried a quiet, desperate tenderness, as if the gestures themselves might keep the smallpox at bay. The sense of dread was omnipresent. It was carried in the air, in the smell of vinegar and disinfectant, in the trembling of hands and the flicker of lamplight against the walls. Each nurse, each mother, each doctor knew that despite their vigilance, the disease moved inexorably, indifferent to hope, fear, or prayers. Smallpox was patient, smallpox was relentless, and so the ward endured. Hours passed in soft, measured movements, punctuated only by coughing, murmurs, and the ever-present scent that clung to the walls like a silent witness. The vinegar and the dread mingled into a single, tangible presence, a reminder that in Victorian London, sickness was never merely a visitor, it was a tenant, and it did not leave easily. Constable Harper had walked these streets for nearly 20 years, his boots worn at the heels, his uniform threadbare in patches where years of weather and duty had taken their toll. He prided himself on his diligence, on the authority he carried in the weight of his posture and the crispness of his whistle. Yet, on this morning in Whitechapel, as he approached the Harcourt residence with its chalk X glaring like a verdict in white powder, he found himself hesitating, looking away, pretending the door did not exist. He would later tell no one why. Perhaps it was the rumor of smallpox that had grown thick as the fog, seeping through the neighborhood like a whisper of death. Perhaps it was the memory of Mrs. Harcourt's pale face, or Edwin's flushed cheeks, or the nurse kneeling endlessly beside the cot, murmuring into the fevered darkness. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a quiet, instinctive knowledge that no uniform, no authority, could protect him from what lay within. So he walked past the house, eyes averted. His gaze followed the cracked stones of the sidewalk, the puddles dark and oily with early morning rain. He heard the faint shuffle of a footstep behind him, a child, perhaps, venturing too close to the boundaries of the forbidden home. He nodded briefly to the figure, then continued, as though the boy were a shadow of his own fear, not a person. All along Whitechapel Road, others had adopted the same practice. Windows shuttered, curtains drawn, heads ducked low. Even the milkman had taken a wide berth around the Harcourt gate, his clinking bottles muted by the hush that pressed against the houses. Londoners understood, without words, the power of the chalk X, the significance of the smallpox mark, the danger that lingered like a whisper behind every closed door. Constable Harper rounded the corner and paused at the lamp-post, listening. The street seemed unnaturally quiet, the ordinary morning noises suspended, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Somewhere far off, a cart creaked under the weight of something unseen. Somewhere closer, a child coughed. Harper exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. His hands itched to do something to enforce the rules, to knock, to check, but he did nothing. Looking away had become a protection, a way to preserve some fragile illusion of safety. He thought of his own children at home, their faces pressed to the glass of the nursery window, watching the fog and the passers-by. What would he tell them if the sickness reached their door? How could he explain the helplessness, the quiet surrender of a city that feared its own shadows? The knowledge weighed on him, heavier than the truncheon at his belt, heavier than the polished brass buttons on his coat. By mid-morning, Harper had walked 2 more blocks. He glanced back once, catching a faint movement behind the curtains of the Harcourt parlour. A hand pressed to glass. A fevered child stirring beneath blankets. The nurse's whisper carried faintly, too soft to discern, yet heavy with its own meaning. Harper swallowed hard and turned forward again, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. The chalk X remained visible behind him, unyielding, marking the house and all who dwelled within as untouchable. He continued his patrol mechanically, nodding to neighbours without meeting their gaze, following the rhythms of a routine that now felt hollow. The city had learned to protect itself through avoidance, and he, like everyone else, had adapted. Fear had become a kind of law, and compliance was as quiet and unremarkable as the fog that coiled through the streets. And as Constable Harper moved down Whitechapel Road, the Harcourt house receded behind him, a house that would not be approached, a door that would not be opened, a family suspended in the shadow of illness. In Victorian London, the streets themselves became a silent accomplice, and even those sworn to uphold order learned, sometimes reluctantly, that looking away was the only shield against the dread that lingered in every breath, every shadow, and every whispered fear. Evening had fallen over Whitechapel, though in the dense fog it felt as though night had already claimed the street by early afternoon. The lamps that usually lined the road, casting pale pools of yellow against the wet cobblestones, were absent in front of the Harcourt home. Neighbours whispered later that no light had been lit, not a single candle, not a lantern, not even a match struck in the window to signal life within. It was as if the house had resigned itself entirely to the darkness, leaving the street to its shadows. Inside, the parlour was dark except for the dim glow of a dying fire in the grate. Mrs. Harcourt sat in a high-backed chair, her fingers woven tight in her lap. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, followed the shadows as they stretched along the walls, dancing faintly in response to the last flickers of flame. Every sound, every cough, every scrape of the floorboards echoed like a distant bell tolling the slow passage of time. The absence of light made the house feel smaller, more fragile, as though one strong gust of wind could shatter it entirely. Upstairs, Edwin's bed was a landscape of fever and despair. His body writhed beneath the thin blanket, every shiver, every groan amplified in the stillness. The smallpox pustules had darkened, the once pale specks now raised and glossy against his cheeks and arms. Nurse Eleanor leaned close, whispering his name, pressing damp cloths to his forehead, coaxing sips of water from lips cracked and parched. In the absence of lamps and artificial light, the shadows pooled around her, swallowing the edges of her form. Her hands, once confident, trembled slightly as she adjusted the boy's thin sheets, her movements careful as though disturbing the air might send the disease swarming. The house's silence was deliberate. The Harcourts understood that a flicker of light might draw attention. People already walked with careful steps, avoiding the front of the house as if a single glance could transmit contagion. No one came to call, no postman dared linger, no child dared peek past the drawn curtains. In Victorian London, darkness was a shield as well as a signal. It both concealed and warned. Mrs. Harcourt's thoughts drifted to the neighbours she had once greeted with warmth. The seamstress, the milkman, the baker's boy, all now kept a prudent distance. Children avoided the garden, mothers crossed the street. The house was no longer part of the street's rhythm. It existed apart, a silent sentinel of fear. Without a lamp in its window, it seemed to vanish at night, leaving only the chalk X glowing faintly in the dim fog, a mark that whispered both warning and lament. Eleanor rose and moved toward the window, cautiously pulling back a curtain just enough to peer into the street. The fog shifted and twisted, swallowing the outlines of passers-by and the distant lamplight, leaving only the sound of feet hurried along wet stones. No one paused, no one looked. All was quiet except for the occasional cough carried faintly on the air. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, inhaling the mixture of damp fog, coal smoke, and the unmistakable, acrid scent of smallpox itself. The odor was sharp, subtle, omnipresent, a reminder that illness was both inside and outside, invisible and inescapable. The Harcourt children, huddled near their mother, stirred at the sound of footsteps above. Their shadows flickered in the feeble glow of the hearth, their eyes reflecting fear and uncertainty. They had long ceased to ask questions, their understanding of the sickness a simple, instinctive terror. The absence of light only deepened the quiet oppression, making the rooms feel smaller, the air heavier, the walls closing in. Outside, the street seemed almost abandoned. Neighbours lit no lamps in sympathy or in precaution, leaving the fog to fold over the houses like a suffocating veil. The world beyond the door existed in muted shapes and whispers, a city continuing in life while the Harcourt home remained a pocket of waiting, of vigilance, of dread. Within those walls, no lamp burned, no light eased the tension. Only the murmur of the nurse, the shallow breaths of the sick, and the unyielding darkness kept company with a family suspended between fear and the long, cold night that awaited them. In Victorian London, darkness was both sanctuary and sentence, and tonight the Harcourt home had surrendered fully to it. The wind pressed cold and unrelenting against the panes of the Harcourt home, rattling the sashes in their worn grooves. It carried with it the faint, distant sounds of a city continuing its routine footsteps, the clang of carts, the muted cries of street children, but nothing so close, so intimate, as the sound that had erupted from the upstairs bedroom just moments before, Edwin's cry. It was a single, high, almost musical wail, sharp and sudden, cutting through the house and threatening to pierce the fog beyond the window. Mrs. Harcourt had risen from her chair, heart hammering against ribs that felt too fragile to contain it. She crossed the narrow hallway, shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders, and pressed her palm against the cool glass, listening as the sound echoed faintly into the street. Outside, even the fog seemed to shudder with the resonance of a child in pain. The neighbours did not come to see. They never did. Those who might have glanced from their windows or stepped onto the pavement quickly turned away, walking hastily past, their heads low. A child held tightly to a mother's hand, peering just long enough to see the silhouette of the house shrouded in shadow before being tugged along. And in the quiet that followed, a hush seemed to settle, thick and suffocating, over the block. Inside, Nurse Eleanor Byrne moved with practiced calm, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She knelt beside Edwin's bed, brushing damp hair from his fevered forehead. The cry had been a flare of delirium, a moment of recognition perhaps, or a fleeting memory of comfort sought in vain. The boy's eyes, glassy and red-rimmed, searched the room as if seeking something he could not name. The heat radiating from his small body pressed into Eleanor's palms, burning, insistent, relentless. Mrs. Harcourt stood behind the nurse, gripping the banister for support. She could not speak. Any sound would shatter the fragile balance of the room, the precarious hold the child had on consciousness. Her ears rang with the memory of the cry, sharp as a church bell, and for a moment she imagined it carrying beyond the fog, past the closed doors of neighbors who dared not intervene. In that sound lived the essence of fear, isolation, and the inescapable truth of smallpox in Victorian London. The window itself seemed to have become a barrier between two worlds. Behind it, life pressed against illness, the mundane against the unimaginable. Beyond it, streets and houses continued, indifferent, moving in patterns shaped by avoidance and whispered caution. No light shone from the Harcourt home, no one dared approach. The chalk X glimmered faintly in the half-light, a mark of warning and inevitability. Eleanor soothed the boy's trembling hands, murmuring softly in tones meant to anchor him. "You are safe," she whispered, though the words felt like a fragile raft on a tide too powerful to be held. She adjusted the blanket across his chest, fanning the slight coolness of a damp cloth over his burning skin. The pustules had darkened further, each one a small, cruel declaration of the fever's progression. Mrs. Harcourt could not look away. She pressed her cheek to the cool glass of the window, feeling the vibration of her son's cries as though they travelled through the wood and plaster. She had long since ceased to hope that the world outside would intervene. The city's caution, its fear, was a force just as palpable as the disease itself. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the outlines of neighbors' houses and street lamps. The Harcourt home remained a dark, silent sentinel, punctuated only by the faint echo of the cry. And as night deepened, the sound became a memory that lingered behind closed windows, threading itself into the fabric of the block, carrying with it the unspoken truth. Smallpox had arrived, and the world, though aware, was powerless, bound by fear, and unwilling to cross the threshold. In Victorian London, a cry behind a closed window was more than a sound. It was a story. It was a warning. It was the echo of life on the edge of despair. Dr. Avery's hand hovered over the small steel needle, its slender point glinting faintly in the flickering lamplight. It lay on the folded linen, next to a vial of vaccine that smelled faintly of alcohol and promise. Yet despite the careful preparations, despite the quiet prayers murmured under his breath, he could not shake the weight of dread pressing against his chest. The needle, innocuous in appearance, carried more than medicine. It carried hope and suspicion, fear, and the terrible responsibility of life and death. Victorian London was not a city of blind trust. Every new remedy, every surgical intervention, every vial of vaccine was met with cautious eyes, whispered doubts, and sometimes outright hostility. Mothers feared their children would shriek under the prick, or worse, that the procedure might fail and the smallpox flourish anyway. Neighbors gossiped that the needle itself could harm more than the disease, that the act of vaccination might introduce another, unseen evil. Nurse Eleanor stood nearby, her hands steady despite exhaustion, holding Edwin's wrist gently. She had seen fear many times before, though never layered so thickly with the pall of death that now hung over the Harcourt household. Even the boy sensed it. His small fingers twitched, half in fever, half in instinctive resistance. He recoiled slightly, eyes fluttering shut, as if to shield himself from the threat he could not name. Mrs. Harcourt knelt beside the cot, murmuring assurances that felt fragile and inadequate against the gravity of the moment. She smoothed her son's damp hair back from his forehead, pressing her palm lightly against his fevered cheek. Every breath she took seemed to carry the weight of the city's fear, every heartbeat a reminder of what might happen if the needle failed, if the disease won, if the world outside did not intervene. Dr. Avery took a deep breath. He had seen countless children in this stage of the illness, flushed, weak, trembling, marked with pustules that turned skin into a battlefield of crimson and white. He knew the needle could offer protection, but only if administered correctly, and only if the body responded. Still, no parent fully trusted it. Every needle he wielded had been met with hesitation, every injection an act of faith, fear, and defiance. He steadied his hand, the metal glinting like a shard of silver under the lamp. Eleanor whispered Edwin's name, gently holding his wrist while the boy's small body quivered beneath the blanket. "Mrs." Harcourt whispered, "It will help, my darling. I promise." But even as she spoke, she felt the tremor of doubt that had settled over every home, every street, every mother who had learned the cruel, indiscriminate reach of smallpox. The needle descended. A moment of resistance, a sudden inhalation of breath, a sharp pinch, and then it was done. The boy blinked, uncertain, eyes half closed from fever and pain. Dr. Avery removed the needle and set it carefully aside, wiping it clean before returning it to its case. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his shoulders, only to be replaced immediately by the creeping awareness that this act, though small, had carried the weight of the household and, in some measure, the neighborhood itself. The room fell silent, save for Edwin's uneven breathing. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and the street remained eerily still. Every neighbor knew the meaning of the needle. Every passerby understood that this family had confronted the specter of disease with the most modern instrument their city could muster, and yet the fear lingered like a shadow that no flame could dispel. In Victorian Britain, the needle was more than a tool. It was a symbol of hope and a reminder of how deeply mistrust, fear, and dread had taken root in a city haunted by invisible enemies. And as the night deepened in Whitechapel, the small house sat quiet, illuminated only by the dim lamp, a place where the sick, the fearful, and the brave waited together, suspended in the fragile balance between life and the relentless, invisible threat that prowled every street. Mr. Pembroke, the registrar at the parish office on Bishopsgate, sat hunched over a desk that seemed to sag beneath the weight of its own history. Ink-stained fingers hovered over ledgers filled with names, dates, and signatures, the pale candlelight trembling across the pages as though afraid to linger too long. Outside, fog pressed against the office windows, curling along the panes like smoke from a funeral pyre, thick with the faint coppery scent of the river and the sharp tang of coal smoke. Inside, the scent of ink and parchment mixed with an invisible tension, the unspoken dread of lives counted and marked, of children lost before they could take their first steps into the wider world. For Mr. Pembroke, each day brought a new wave of entries, each one heavier than the last. Families who had once visited the office to register baptisms or record marriages now arrived with their faces pale, shoulders stooped, bearing news that weighed on the registrar more than the heaviest ledgers. Children had fallen ill, infants had passed in their first fevered nights, entire households had vanished behind doors marked with chalk X's. The registers that once told of beginnings now chronicled absence and loss. He dipped his pen into the inkwell, the black liquid shimmering in the flickering light. He wrote slowly, deliberately, as if each stroke might anchor the names, or perhaps grant them some measure of protection. But protection was an illusion. Smallpox swept through the streets with indifferent cruelty, claiming its victims regardless of prayers or record-keeping, leaving Mr. Pembroke's careful script as little more than a brittle memorial. A young assistant, barely out of apprenticeship, approached hesitantly, glancing toward the doorway, as though the fog itself might carry contagion. "Sir," he whispered, voice thin, "another report has arrived from Whitechapel." The Harcourt boy. He faltered, unsure how to continue. Mr. Pembroke did not need the words. He could feel the weight of the news settle in the room like dust. "Bring it here." he said softly, voice low with the exhaustion of too many such mornings. The assistant handed over a folded sheet of paper, stamped and marked with the parish seal. Mr. Pembroke read it carefully, tracing each line with a finger as though confirming reality against the ink. One name, then another. Fever, isolation, delay, mortality, and beneath it all, the inexorable confirmation. Smallpox had claimed yet another household. He leaned back in his chair, eyes moving across the ledger before him. Rows upon rows of names stared back, ghostly in the candlelight. Children, mothers, fathers all accounted for, and yet not truly present. Some had been taken days ago, some weeks. Some, like Edwin Harcourt, remained suspended between illness and recovery, a fragile breath away from either fate. Each entry pressed against him with an almost tangible weight, the responsibility of recording lives and deaths, stretching his shoulders and bending his spine. Outside, the fog shifted along the streets, obscuring the houses, the silent passers-by, the chalk X's on doors. Inside, the registrar continued to write, each name a quiet confession, a whisper of grief, a testament to the relentlessness of disease. He paused occasionally, staring at the candle, feeling the tremor of exhaustion in his hands. They were steady enough to write, but he knew the weight of all these names would linger long after the ink had dried. For in Victorian London, the registrar was more than a keeper of records. He was a witness to the city's suffering, a silent chronicler of smallpox's indiscriminate cruelty. Each ledger entry was a story condensed to ink on paper, a life reduced to letters, a measure of mortality that no mother's prayers could alter. And so Mr. Pembroke wrote on, his candle flickering against the fogged window, the shadows of names stretching along the walls like the long, quiet reach of disease itself. By the third week of Edwin Harcourt's fever, the city's whispering had spread beyond Whitechapel, reaching into neighbouring lanes and even crossing over into small hamlets tucked just beyond London's dense heart. The authorities, prompted by the grim registers that Mr. Pembroke maintained with such weary precision, decreed a quarantine for affected households. It was not a gentle measure, nor one born of mercy. It was a practical necessity, imposed with ink-stamped authority, and it fell with a sudden, terrible finality upon entire streets, entire blocks, entire families. For the Harcourts, the decree arrived as a polite knock in the early evening, the messenger bowing and retreating before the door could be fully opened. It carried a folded parchment, its wax seal impressively formal, yet somehow cold and impersonal. The letter instructed them to remain within their home for a period unspecified, to avoid contact with neighbours, to allow no visitors, and to trust that the city would provide food and assistance only through intermediaries. Behind the words lay an unspoken truth. The world outside would continue, indifferent to their suffering, while they were to be contained, watched, and if they faltered, ignored. In the streets beyond, the village fractured almost immediately. Children were kept indoors, apprentices were forbidden from entering their masters' homes, market traders diverted their carts to avoid the quarantine blocks entirely. Even the most compassionate neighbours began crossing the street, keeping tight holds on their skirts or coats, whispering furtive warnings to those they passed. Whitechapel's familiar rhythm, the clatter of pails, the cries of vendors, the clomp of boots along the cobblestones fell into dissonance, replaced by silence, punctuated only by the occasional cough or the distant tolling of a bell. Inside the Harcourt home, the air grew heavier with every hour. The rooms seemed smaller, as if the walls themselves pressed inward, tightening around the family and the nurse who refused to leave their side. Edwin's small body trembled beneath the thin blankets, fever and chills alternating with cruel precision, and his cries, soft now, weary, echoed through the darkened hallways. Eleanor moved tirelessly between beds, bowls of cool water in her hands, damp cloths pressed to fevered brows, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. The house became a microcosm of suffering, a universe suspended between illness and isolation. The mother, Mrs. Harcourt, pressed herself to the window from time to time, her eyes straining to see the street that no longer belonged to her. The chalk X gleamed faintly in the fog outside, a silent testament to the quarantine's authority. She watched as neighbors hurried past, their eyes cast down, whispers curling like smoke around corners. A mother carried her children in haste, pulling them away from the block. A butcher's boy set down a basket of vegetables several yards from the door before retreating. All movement was careful, measured, distant. Meals were delivered in small parcels, left at the doorstep, and retrieved hours later. No one spoke. Communication was minimized to prevent inadvertent exposure. Letters, once a comfort, arrived in brief. Clinical notes, stamped and signed by authorities, often containing more instruction than solace. The family ate in silence, aware that each sound could carry fear, each movement could draw unwanted attention from the outside. Evenings stretched long, marked by the soft wheezing of Edwin's breathing, the occasional cough that punctuated the darkness, and the quiet shuffle of Eleanor's skirts along the worn floors. Every creak of the floorboards reminded the family that they were imprisoned not by bars, but by the invisible weight of suspicion and contagion. The quarantine fractured more than the village. It fractured trust, friendship, and normalcy. People who had once nodded and exchanged greetings now skirted the houses like strangers avoiding a shadow. Families grew isolated, neighbors estranged, and the street itself became a line drawn in invisible chalk, dividing the safe from the afflicted. In Victorian Britain, the quarantine was a tool of survival, yes, but also a cruel mirror. It reflected the fear of disease, the frailty of social bonds, and the quiet cruelty of a city forced to protect itself. And in the Harcourt home, the days passed slowly, each one a reminder that the world outside no longer existed for them, and that life, when measured in breath and fever, could be as solitary as death itself. Margaret Ellison, the milkmaid who had delivered cream and clotted milk along Whitechapel Road for more than a decade, moved through the early fog with her usual care, balancing her heavy pails and stepping lightly over the slick cobblestones. Her cheeks were flushed from the morning chill, her breath forming faint clouds as she called out her greetings to shuttered doors. Yet, in the shadow of the Harcourt house, she hesitated, glancing up at the chalk X that marked the home of fever and fear. She, like everyone else, knew the danger that lingered inside, yet she carried none of it with her. Strange as it seemed, Margaret had been in contact with the afflicted repeatedly over the past week, delivering milk to households with fevered children, handling pails that had brushed against curtains, glancing briefly at flushed cheeks and blistered arms. She had seen the pustules, smelled the acrid tang of smallpox, and yet, when the nurse Eleanor had glanced down the street with worry etched across her face, Margaret had returned to her cart, unharmed. Some whispered that it was luck. Others muttered that Margaret carried a secret remedy, a charm, or perhaps a constitution unusually resistant. She herself did not know why the disease had not claimed her, but she had learned quickly that whispers could carry their own poison. People gave her wide berths, watched her curiously, questioned her silently, and sometimes a mother would mutter prayers under her breath when Margaret's boots passed the chalk-marked door. Margaret's immunity was a quiet wonder, and yet it carried a weight heavier than any illness. She could not touch the Harcourt's door. She could not linger, she could not speak, and she could not help the children in the rooms above. The street itself seemed alive with invisible caution. Neighbors crossing quickly, children hurrying past, and even the fog pressing down with an almost sentient awareness that danger lingered unseen. She understood that her freedom to move was contingent not upon her own will, but upon the caprice of circumstance and the delicate favor of fortune. She continued her rounds, delivering milk to homes that had not yet been touched by the fever. Each knock on a shuttered door brought a sharp intake of breath from the occupants, a pause before they accepted the pail. Margaret had learned to offer her greetings softly, to smile without seeming too full of vitality, to present herself as ordinary. Even a hint of cheerfulness could be seen as suspicious in those days. Her immunity was a quiet, isolating burden. At the corner near the Harcourt house, she paused to glance up the fogged street. The chalk X was faintly visible in the grey haze, a warning and a promise. Children, peering from behind closed curtains, craned their necks to catch a glimpse of her passing. Mothers whispered in hushed tones about the milkmaid who touched no disease, who carried no illness, and yet returned each day to the same streets, always untouched. Margaret tilted her head to the sky, listening to the distant hum of London waking, the clatter of carts, the faint barking of dogs, the distant tolling of church bells. It was all ordinary, almost soothing, and yet she knew that a single misstep, an overlooked pail, a stray touch, a forgotten smear of milk, could change everything. Her rounds completed, Margaret rested for a brief moment against a lamp-post, the fog curling around her like a protective shroud. She breathed deeply, tasting the faint tang of coal and mist, and reflected on the odd fortune that had spared her while the city's children suffered, isolated and frail. She did not rejoice. She merely accepted the quiet, strange balance of survival in a city gripped by fear. In Victorian London, immunity was not always a blessing. It was a burden. And for the milkmaid, each day carried the weight of observation, whispers, and the impossible responsibility of moving untouched through a world falling ill. The wards of St. Brigid's Hospital were a labyrinth of narrow corridors, low ceilings, and the persistent, clinging scent of vinegar and disinfectant. Here, the sick were not merely treated, they were catalogued, measured, and contained. The walls, whitewashed long ago but now streaked with the grey residue of coal smoke and damp, seemed to bend inward under the weight of fevered breaths and whispered prayers. Nurse Eleanor Byrne moved swiftly among the cots, her skirts brushing the worn floor, hands steady despite the pervasive exhaustion that weighed upon her every joint. Children and adults alike lay sprawled beneath thin blankets, their skin mottled with the telltale crimson and white of smallpox pustules. Some muttered names, others whimpered in the throes of delirium, and a few, mercifully, were still asleep, their faces pale and calm in brief reprieve. Eleanor moved between them all, checking their temperatures with damp cloths, offering spoonfuls of water, adjusting blankets, whispering encouragement into ears too fevered to respond. Each motion was deliberate, careful, a ritual born of necessity and fear. At the far end of the ward, Edwin Harcourt lay upon a narrow cot, his small body convulsing in the fever's grip. Mrs. Harcourt sat beside him, pale and stiff-backed, fingers intertwined tightly over his arm, a futile gesture of protection against a force neither prayer nor love could halt. Eleanor knelt beside them, pressing cool cloths to Edwin's brow, murmuring his name in low tones. She had learned long ago that fever did not respond to words, but words might keep the spirit tethered just enough to endure. The room smelled strongly of camphor, vinegar, and the faint, metallic tang of blood. It was a heady mixture that seemed to cling to clothing and hair, leaving its invisible mark upon every visitor. Nurse Byrne inhaled deeply, steadying herself before tending to the next bed. The faintest draught from a cracked window carried the odor beyond the walls, mingling with the city's fog, reminding the world outside of the quiet horrors within. The ward was crowded but orderly, as much as any place could be in the grip of smallpox. Cots lined the walls, separated by faded curtains that offered only an illusion of privacy. Each child's face bore the marks of fever, and yet in each, Eleanor saw the fragile flicker of life, a thread she was determined to hold. A cough rattled from a boy in the corner. A mother shifted uneasily, murmuring reassurances that she barely felt herself. Each sound seemed magnified, echoing off the walls in the cold lamplight. Eleanor moved from bed to bed, her hands washing, dabbing and pressing, a constant rhythm against the chaos of illness. The patient's breaths were shallow, uneven, sometimes terrifyingly still, and she attended to each with unwavering care, aware that the slightest lapse could be fatal. The ward was a world unto itself, a space suspended between life and death, between hope and despair, where time passed in fevered hours rather than minutes. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling in and out like the breath of the city. Whitechapel Road was silent, save for the distant clatter of a cart or the muffled cry of a child from a neighbouring street. No one dared approach, and the chalk X on the Harcourt door gleamed faintly through the haze, a quiet sentinel marking the edge of the ward's influence, the boundary between health and contagion. By nightfall, exhaustion had settled over the room like a thick blanket. Eleanor paused beside Edwin's cot, adjusting his blankets one final time before settling into a chair at his side. Mrs. Harcourt rested her head against the mattress, her hands still clutching her son's. The ward, though ragged, held them all in a fragile balance, a place where care met fear, where love met inevitability, and where the relentless march of smallpox could only be watched, endured, and attended to as best as human hands could manage. In Victorian London, a hospital ward was more than a room. It was a testament, a quiet theatre of suffering and hope, and in its dim corners, the ragged ward held witness to the courage, devotion, and relentless dread that defined a city at the mercy of disease. The apothecary on Hanbury Street kept its shutters tightly closed, though the lamp inside burned steadily, casting a faint glow through the frosted glass. Mr. Fenwick sat behind the counter, hunched over a ledger whose pages were filled with scribbled notes, lists of names, doses, and deliveries. Each entry carried the weight of responsibility, each number a measure of suffering in a city that seemed to breathe through fog, coal smoke, and whispered dread. Outside, the wind pressed against the street, carrying the faint clatter of distant carts. But here, in this small room scented of herbs and vinegar, the world had narrowed to the quiet vigil of one man against a relentless disease. The day had begun like any other. Mothers had appeared at the shop, their eyes wide with worry, glancing anxiously at the door. Children clutched hands and skirts, whispering questions to their elders about who had fallen ill, who had been marked, and who would be next. Fenwick offered powders and tinctures, soothing words, and careful instructions, knowing full well that the remedies were but fragile shields against a spectre that moved unseen. His hands, long accustomed to the careful handling of glass and herb, shook faintly beneath the weight of so many lives. The chalk X's had multiplied along the street like pale stars in the fog, each one marking a home where fear had nested. Families isolated themselves, shutters drawn, doors locked. Fenwick knew the smallpox had claimed more than flesh. It had claimed trust, companionship, and the rhythm of ordinary life. The apothecary itself had become a refuge for some, a place where the afflicted might find counsel, instructions, and the rare comforts of measured attention. Yet even here, he could not save them. He could only provide guidance, hope, and the careful, painstaking administration of what little science offered. At mid-morning, a mother hurried into the shop, dragging a fevered child behind her. The child's face was mottled, eyes glassy with fatigue, hands trembling as if the fever had infused them with its own tremor. Fenwick received them silently, measuring doses, adjusting tinctures, and writing precise instructions in his ledger. Every movement was deliberate, every word measured. He had learned that in times like these, fear could undo more than disease, and precision in both medicine and counsel was the only armor available. Outside, the fog thickened. London pressed against the windows like a living entity, indistinct but oppressive, swallowing sounds, bending shadows, and masking movement. Street lights glimmered faintly through the haze, the faintest halos around their flames. Couriers moved silently, taking packages of powders, potions, and instructions to homes marked by isolation and dread. Fenwick watched the fog as he prepared parcels for delivery, knowing that each contained a fragile thread of hope, perhaps the last before the fever claimed its mark. Hours passed in quiet ritual. Fenwick moved between shelves, arranging vials, crushing herbs, and measuring doses with meticulous care. The scent of lavender, camphor, and anise filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of disinfectant. Outside, the city continued, indifferent and relentless, while the apothecary remained a sanctuary of vigilance. He paused only to look at the frosted windows, at the shapes of distant chimneys swallowed by fog, at the faint glimmer of a chalk X across the street. As evening fell, Fenwick extinguished a candle, leaving only the faint glow of the lamp above the counter. He rested his hands on the ledger, eyes tracing names, dates, and instructions once more. The shop was quiet, the fog thickening outside, the city distant. He remained a solitary sentinel, guarding the fragile lives that passed through his hands, measuring hope in vials and powders, in advice whispered and doses delivered. In Victorian London, the apothecary was more than a place of trade. It was a sanctuary, a witness, a quiet bastion against the relentless march of disease. And for Mr. Fenwick, each day ended with the same vigil. The careful, silent watch over lives, suspended between health and despair, shadowed by the presence of a spectre that claimed the streets, the homes, and the hearts of all who lived beneath its fog. The Thames lay dark and thick beneath the pallid dawn, its surface broken only by the long, narrow hull of the hospital ship moored near Wapping. The vessel had been converted hastily, its decks lined with narrow cots and canvas partitions, its hold filled with medicines, linens, and the faint, acrid scent of disinfectants. From the riverbank, the ship looked like a phantom rising from the fog, a ghostly vessel carrying the suffering of London's poorest children away from the crowded streets, if only for a time. Nurse Eleanor Byrne stood at the gangway, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, eyes scanning the mist for signs of movement. The ship's lanterns glowed softly, reflecting in the water like pale eyes watching the city. Below, the river lapped against the hull, carrying the scent of brine, coal smoke, and the faint copper tang of fever and illness. She stepped aboard carefully, boots echoing on the wooden deck, aware that every footfall seemed magnified in the quiet morning. Inside, the wards were narrow and dim, a makeshift hospital confined to the ship's elongated form. Each cot held a child, their skin mottled with crimson and white, their breaths shallow and uneven. The smallpox raged in these bodies with the same relentless cruelty that had stalked the streets for weeks. Eleanor moved from cot to cot, pressing damp cloths to foreheads, offering spoonfuls of water, whispering reassurances into ears, too fevered to comprehend. Each motion was careful, deliberate, and necessary, a fragile attempt to hold back the tide of suffering that threatened to sweep through every thin blanket and linen sheet. The ship creaked under its own weight, responding to the movement of the river and the shifting of its living cargo. A soft wind slipped through the partially open hatches, carrying with it the distant cries of gulls and the faint, muffled clang of dockside activity. Outside, the fog pressed along the water, obscuring the city, making the ship seem both a sanctuary and a tomb. Every shadow along the walls seemed to quiver with life, every distant sound exaggerated, every cough echoing in the narrow corridor with a cruel resonance. A small boy near the bows stirred and moaned, clutching a thin blanket to his chest. Eleanor bent beside him, speaking softly, smoothing damp hair from his fevered forehead. His eyes fluttered open briefly, glazed with fever and fear, and then closed again. Across the ward, another child whimpered, and Eleanor adjusted the cloths and linens with practiced care. She had long since ceased to notice the stink of sickness, the mixture of sweat, disinfectant, and fevered flesh, but the weight of it pressed against her nonetheless, a constant reminder of the stakes at hand. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Avery, moved between cots with deliberate, slow steps, his polished bag left at the foot of the narrow aisle. He administered doses, recorded observations, and whispered instructions to the nurses, who nodded and moved with quiet efficiency. Each life was a delicate balance, each action measured against the inexorable progression of the disease. Outside, the river flowed with the indifference of time, carrying London's fog, its smoke, and the distant cries of the city's children to points unknown. By evening, the ship seemed to settle into itself. The lamps glowed dimly along the deck, the fog thickened, and the sounds of the Thames grew muted. Eleanor paused beside Edwin's cot, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in the rhythm of fever, murmuring softly, her hand steady despite her exhaustion. Outside, the city remained distant, unaware, indifferent. The hospital ship existed in its own fragile world, floating above the river yet tethered to the suffering below, carrying the weight of lives, suspended between illness and hope. In Victorian London, the hospital ship on the Thames was both refuge and sentinel, a place where the living and the fevered coexisted under lamplight and fog. And aboard it, nurses and doctors kept vigil, hands steady, hearts strained, as the relentless spectre of smallpox stalked the city, patient, inevitable, and unseen. The Harcourt parlour was heavy with the quiet of approaching night. The shadows stretched long and trembling along the walls, as though recoiling from the weight of dread that clung to every corner. Mrs. Harcourt moved with trembling hands toward the narrow bedroom, carrying a basket filled with the boys' linens. Each sheet, pillowcase, and blanket bore the faint, damp imprint of fever, the subtle scent of sweat and camphor, and the invisible trace of the smallpox that had claimed Edwin's body in life and spirit. Her fingers quivered as she set the basket on the hearth, inhaling sharply through her shawl. Fear had sharpened into ritual. She would not allow these linens to linger in the house. They were carriers, not only of the disease, but of a quiet, insidious terror that might cling to anything left behind. The fire was ready, the flames curling hungrily, consuming logs that hissed and spat as she added the sheets. One by one, she laid them upon the fire, watching them curl, blacken, and disintegrate, the smoke rising in thin, twisting plumes that carried with it the scent of vinegar and despair. Clara, clutching her doll, peered from the corner, eyes wide. "Mama, will it hurt them?" she asked softly, as if the sheets themselves were capable of life. Mrs. Harcourt drew her close, pressing her hand to the child's small back. "No, my darling," she murmured. "They are only sheets. They must go, so we may be safe." Yet even as she spoke, she felt a chill settle across her shoulders. The ritual, necessary though it was, felt almost like an admission that the disease had already claimed its power within the walls, that fear was as infectious as the fever itself. The flames hungrily consumed the first few sheets, their edges curling into ash, blackened fragments drifting upward. Mrs. Harcourt moved with deliberate care, adding each piece, rearranging them to ensure every corner was touched by fire. The smoke filled the room, twisting and curling, mingling with the faint odor of camphor and the subtle tang of illness. She held her breath, listening to the crackle and hiss, the sound amplified by the quiet house, and felt the oppressive weight of solitude press against her chest. Eleanor Byrne hovered nearby, silently assisting when needed. Her hands were steady, her expression calm, though her eyes betrayed the fatigue and sorrow that never left her in this city of shadows. She had seen countless homes, countless families, perform similar acts, rituals designed to ward off invisible threats, to mark boundaries against death, but each one carried a pang of tragedy, a reminder that fear and grief often worked as silently and destructively as smallpox itself. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, muffling distant footsteps, the clatter of carts, and the faint, hesitant calls of street children. The house remained isolated, a small fortress suspended in dread. Even the chalk X on the front door seemed to glimmer faintly in the pale lamplight, a sentinel marking the boundary between the living and the infected. Within the Harcourt home, fire became a tool of survival, a protective act rendered in ash and smoke. By the time the last sheet had curled into embers, the room was thick with the scent of burned fabric, camphor, and lingering fear. Mrs. Harcourt sank into a chair, wiping damp palms across her cheeks. Clara remained silent at her side, the doll pressed tightly to her chest. Even the flames, now reduced to a gentle glow, seemed to shiver in the oppressive stillness. In Victorian London, the act of burning bedsheets was more than sanitation. It was a ritual of control in a world stripped of certainty. It was a defense against the invisible, a gesture of both grief and defiance. And in the quiet smoke rising from the hearth, the Harcourt family sealed themselves against the relentless spectre of smallpox, if only for a night. The city of London slept uneasily under the pale glow of gas lamps, though sleep was a tentative luxury in streets haunted by the spectre of smallpox. The fog pressed against every chimney and evestrophe, curling along the cobblestones and drifting into the open windows of shuttered homes. Somewhere beyond Whitechapel Road, a single lantern bobbed against the grey, moving with deliberate, almost ritualistic care. It belonged to the undertaker, Mr. Thorne, a thin man with a pale face and eyes trained to the quiet horror that others avoided. He carried his tools in a heavy leather satchel, strapped across his shoulder, and his hands were steady despite the chill in the air. Inside, the bag held gloves, shrouds, and instruments that smelled faintly of vinegar and antiseptic. For weeks, Mr. Thorne had moved along streets thick with fog and rumour, visiting houses marked with chalk X's, transporting those claimed by smallpox to resting places, prepared in haste, in secrecy, and with careful respect. Tonight, he approached the Harcourt home with measured steps, boots clicking softly on the wet cobblestones. The chalk X on the door gleamed pale and accusatory in the fog, a stark warning that the house was still a site of fear and disease. No lights shone from the windows, and the street was empty, save for the occasional silhouette hurried along by instinctive avoidance. Mr. Thorne paused, breathing through the scarf wrapped tightly around his mouth, inhaling the cold air, the faint coal smoke, and the subtle, acrid scent that always accompanied smallpox. He did not knock. The families he served had long since learned that a knock was unnecessary. The house knew he would come, as surely as the tide knows the riverbank. He lifted the latch quietly, stepping inside. The familiar, oppressive scent of camphor and illness greeted him immediately. Missus. Harcourt's hands were clasped tightly over her face, and Nurse Eleanor moved toward him with measured calm. Edwin lay between them, flushed and fevered, his small body trembling beneath the thin blankets. The undertaker worked efficiently, methodically. He prepared the shrouds, folding them with care, placing them within the polished wooden box that would soon carry the sick or, if fate had intervened, the dead away from the house. He had performed this ritual countless times, yet each home carried its own weight, each child and parent a reminder of the relentless cruelty of smallpox. Outside, the fog seemed to pulse, thick and unyielding. The city beyond continued its routines, indifferent to the suffering behind closed doors, unaware of the quiet procession of shadows and grief that moved silently along the streets. Mr. Thorne worked with the knowledge that his presence was both necessary and unwelcome, a bearer of inevitability. Each motion, adjusting blankets, straightening the cot, lifting the small hands into gloves, was deliberate, careful, and burdened with solemnity. By midnight, the preparations were complete. The lantern's glow illuminated the weary faces of those remaining in the room, but no light escaped the house. The chalk X outside gleamed faintly in the mist, a sentinel marking boundaries of life and death. Mr. Thorne adjusted the lid of the box one final time, ensuring that every detail was correct, every movement silent. He stepped back, removed his gloves, and placed them carefully into his bag. His eyes lingered on the small cot, on the boy, on the mother and nurse who had watched him work with quiet, fearful reverence. Then he departed, moving through the fog as he had come, leaving the Harcourts in the dim, oppressive quiet of their home. In Victorian London, the undertaker worked after midnight, not out of choice, but necessity. His lanterns were the only light in streets, shrouded in dread, his presence both feared and required. And in the stillness of Whitechapel, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the smallpox held sway, patient, unrelenting, and invisible, while Mr. Thorne moved silently among its victims, a shadow bridging life and death in the fog-bound city. The ink on the heavy parchment was still damp when it left the desk of Dr. Nathaniel Avery, smudged at the edges from nervous fingers and the weight of sleepless nights. The candlelight flickered across the script, casting shadows that danced like ghosts along the wall of his study. Outside, fog pressed thickly against the windows, curling and drifting along Whitechapel Road like a living thing, carrying with it the distant sound of carts, footsteps, and the faint cries of children. Avery's hand paused mid-stroke, lingering over the final words. Every letter, every turn of the quill, bore the burden of truth he could not soften. Smallpox was spreading, relentless and indifferent, and the city teetered on the edge of chaos. He had written and rewritten the letter countless times, weighing each phrase against the potential for panic or misinterpretation. The audience was Parliament itself, a distant, austere body, responsible for law and order, yet removed from the immediate horrors of the streets. He addressed them formally, in the language of careful civility. Yet beneath the surface, the letter trembled with urgency. Every paragraph detailed the number of households affected, the ages of the children struck, the measures already taken, and the failures that lingered despite the vigilance of nurses and apothecaries. A small cough from the hearth drew Avery's attention. His cat, curled atop a chair, flicked an ear and returned to sleep. He exhaled slowly, gripping the quill tightly, aware that this document might carry more weight than any medicine he had administered. For the truth, though written with ink, could travel farther, faster, and with consequences more enduring than any fever. He recounted, in precise detail, the progression of disease among households like the Harcourts. Chalk X's marked doors. Mothers and nurses were held in anxious vigil, and children's cries echoed through fog-thickened streets. The letter detailed the limitations of current remedies. The smallpox vaccine, applied where possible, had met with distrust. Medicines were of little efficacy against the relentless fever and pustules. Each fact, though dry on paper, carried the weight of human suffering, the quiet terror of parents watching their children burn with heat they could not measure or contain. Avery paused again, dipping his quill into the inkwell, and carefully underlined the section that stressed immediate action. Parliament must understand that the city's streets were no longer safe, that isolation and quarantine were measures not of cruelty but necessity, and that the failure to intervene decisively might render the epidemic unstoppable. He wrote of hospital wards overflowing, apothecaries stretched thin, and the impossibility of caring for all afflicted without coordinated, government-sanctioned intervention. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the panes like a tangible weight. Avery imagined the letters reaching the desks of parliamentarians, sitting in the warm, ordered chambers far removed from Whitechapel's cold, narrow streets. Would they understand? Would they act before more children, more families were consumed by fever? The thought weighed heavily, heavier than any ledger or vial, for it was beyond the measure of science, beyond the certainty of medicine. This was a question of will, of morality, of recognition of suffering from afar. Finally, Avery sealed the letter with wax, impressing his signet into the soft red surface. He set it aside, weary in mind and body, knowing that the words alone could not stop the disease, but might summon those with authority to intervene. The city continued outside, fog-laden and silent, streets emptied by fear, houses shuttered, children hidden, while the epidemic moved through them as invisible as air. In Victorian Britain, letters to Parliament were more than correspondence. They were lifelines, records, and warnings. They carried the cries of the afflicted, the exhaustion of caregivers, and the subtle, insistent plea of a city under siege. And tonight, Dr. Avery had sent one such plea, hoping that ink and urgency might reach ears willing to listen before the fever claimed yet another household. The House of Commons was alive with murmurs, the low hum of debate, threading through the high-ceilinged chamber like a restless fog. Gas lamps flickered against polished wood and gilt-edged papers, casting shadows that danced across the faces of legislators. Outside, London's streets lay thick in fog, the distant cries of children and the rattle of carts swallowed by the city's damp embrace. Inside, the urgency of the smallpox epidemic had finally found a voice capable of piercing bureaucracy, a voice that demanded action. Dr. Nathaniel Avery's letter had arrived days prior, delivered with both ceremony and apprehension. The meticulous recounting of the Harcourt household, the hospitals overfilled with the fevered, the overworked nurses, and the anxious mothers, had impressed upon the legislators the immediacy of danger. But words alone, even when inked with precision and weighted with truth, could not compel action. Fear, inertia, and politicking lingered in the chamber, thick and obstructive, like the London fog outside the walls. By evening, however, the weight of evidence had shifted the debate. Parliamentary officers, noting the relentless march of disease through neighbourhoods like Whitechapel, cited the mortality statistics meticulously, their voices grave. "We cannot wait until smallpox has claimed yet another child," one member intoned, glancing toward the gaslight, the flame reflecting off the polished wood of the bench. "Action must be taken now, and it must be uniform. The city, and indeed the nation, cannot survive another lapse." The measure passed not with jubilant applause, but with solemn, measured assent. The Vaccination Act, as it was titled in the official records, mandated the compulsory inoculation of children, the isolation of afflicted households, and the oversight of health officers empowered to enforce quarantine where necessary. The words, though dry on paper, carried the weight of life itself. Gaslight reflected across faces pale with fatigue and worry, illuminating the understanding that these decisions would ripple outward, touching every home, every family, every child. Meanwhile, in Whitechapel, the fog pressed against the windows of shuttered homes, silent witnesses to the city's formal decree. At the Harcourt house, Mrs. Harcourt and Nurse Eleanor listened closely for the distant echo of life beyond the door, the clatter of carts, the hurried steps of neighbours, the muffled cough of street children. But there was only the faint hiss of fog against the glass and the whisper of wind along the chimneys. Edwin's small body lay beneath blankets, fevered and trembling, oblivious to the law that had just passed, yet bound inextricably by its reach. Across London, apothecaries stocked their shelves more meticulously, preparing for the anticipated influx of families seeking inoculation. Hospital wards adjusted their staffing, anticipating increased visits, while nurses and physicians readied themselves for the enforcement of quarantine measures. The gas lamps, flickering in uneven rhythm, illuminated the faces of those preparing to meet the epidemic head-on, their expressions a mixture of determination, fear, and weary resignation. The law, like a new dawn, promised order, oversight, and the hope of protection. But it also carried the weight of enforcement, the inevitability of judgment, and the unspoken fear of reprisal for those who faltered. Families would comply, willingly or otherwise. Children would be inoculated. Homes marked with chalk X's would remain isolated until the fever subsided. The city, as always, adapted, shaped by law, fear, and necessity. Each mechanism of governance pressed into service against the invisible enemy. In Victorian London, the passage of law under gaslight was both a beacon and a shadow. It signalled hope for protection, yet also cast long, insistent shadows over households already fractured by fear. And in the quiet of Whitechapel, behind shuttered doors and drawn curtains, the city held its collective breath, waiting to see whether order, reason, and science could finally bend the relentless hand of smallpox to its will. The parlour was silent, heavy with the lingering scent of camphor and burned linen, the faint tang of fevered flesh still clinging to the air like an uninvited guest. Mrs. Harcourt stood before a narrow, tarnished mirror, the edges dulled by age and soot from countless fires, and for the first time allowed herself to truly look. The reflection staring back was familiar, yet irrevocably altered. Her eyes, once sharp and bright, seemed hollowed by nights of vigil and fear. Her cheeks were pinched from exhaustion, and a subtle pallor clung to her skin like fog over the Thames. She turned her gaze toward the reflection of her hands, pale and tremulous, the skin still faintly marked by the traces of fevered care, the smudges of camphor, the faint discoloration from constant washing, the small scratches left by restless children, or the sharp edge of a cotton cloth. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. Edwin lay upstairs, still and fevered, the rise and fall of his chest a delicate, fragile rhythm. Nurse Eleanor sat nearby, adjusting blankets and whispering low, soothing words that carried the weight of hope, fatigue, and fear. For weeks, the Harcourts had lived in a state suspended between vigilance and despair, and in the mirror, Mrs. Harcourt saw the full toll of that existence reflected back at her. She traced her fingers lightly along the glass, as though attempting to touch a self she feared had been lost. Each line in her face was an echo of the past days, nights spent bending over a cot, long hours spent burning sheets, the constant murmur of fear threading through the house like an invisible wire. Even the faintest reflection of herself felt distant, softened by the haze of exhaustion, as though her image had been altered not by the mirror, but by the relentless passage of trauma. The child's cries, now subdued into soft whimpers, drifted faintly from upstairs. She inhaled deeply, the scent of camphor and disinfectant, mingling with the metallic tang of fever that lingered in the corners of the parlour. Every sound, every smell, every flicker of light seemed intensified, sharpened by the long hours of fear and care. She reached for the mantle, resting her hand on the cool surface, and stared into the mirror once more, confronting a reflection both her own and yet strangely separate, shaped by the presence of disease and the weight of helplessness. Memories surfaced unbidden. The first heat beneath the collar, the chalk X on the door, the soft whisper of neighbours from behind curtains, the letters from the parish office, the hospital ship moored along the Thames all etched themselves into the lines of her face. She saw her husband's absence in the thinness of her cheeks, her children's confusion in the tremor of her hands, and the relentless passage of smallpox in the weariness that pooled beneath her eyes. In this reflection, the house itself seemed to peer back at her, the darkened corners, the drawn curtains, the lingering smell of vinegar, and dread a mirror not only of her body, but of the world the fever had reshaped. Eleanor's soft voice broke the spell. "She stirs, madam," the nurse whispered, her words careful, precise. "I believe he is coming out of the worst." Mrs. Harcourt swallowed, eyes still fixed on the mirror. She saw not just the toll of nights and fear, but the faint glimmer of endurance, a resilience born of necessity, of love, and of the quiet determination to survive another day. She turned from the mirror, drawing a deep breath. The reflection remained, pale and marked, but it no longer felt like a stranger. It was a testament to survival, to care, and to the silent, unyielding passage of days spent in vigilance. In Victorian London, the face in the mirror could reveal both the cost of fear and the fragile hope that clung stubbornly to life. Even in the darkest hours, the fog hung low over Whitechapel, curling around the rooftops and sliding along the cobblestones in a thick, persistent embrace. The hospital, which had been a maelstrom of fever, coughs, and whispered prayers for weeks, now stood strangely quiet. The wards that had once throbbed with the restless energy of suffering beds, packed close, blankets damp with sweat, the murmur of delirious children were lighter, emptier, as if the disease itself had finally released its grip, leaving only echoes behind. Nurse Eleanor Byrne moved slowly along the corridor, her steps muffled against the worn floorboards. She paused at each cot, noting the absence of children and the faint, lingering scent of fevered sheets. The emptiness was startling, the air no longer pressed heavy with sickness. The sharp tang of camphor and vinegar still clung to walls and counters, but it was softened by absence, a reminder that what had dominated these rooms for so long had passed, or at least had moved elsewhere. Mrs. Harcourt stood at the head of the main ward, her hands clasped loosely, her eyes scanning the rows of cots that once teemed with life suspended in illness. Edwin, now pale and weak, lay upon a mattress nearest the window, his breaths shallower but steady. The fever had receded, leaving behind the faint, mottled traces of his ordeal on arms and face. Eleanor sat beside him, adjusting a damp cloth on his forehead, whispering softly. The nurse's voice carried the weight of exhaustion, relief, and persistent vigilance, a murmur meant to tether the boy to life and to the fragile rhythm of the world beyond the hospital walls. The emptiness of the ward was jarring, yet it carried a quiet weight. Each vacant cot bore the memory of its occupant, the boy who had clutched a mother's hand until it went cold, the infant wrapped in hastily laundered linens, the family who had left for the hospital ship on the Thames and never returned. In the dim lamplight, the absence was palpable. Shadows lingered longer, as if reluctant to release the shapes of those who had filled them. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a heavy cloth, muffling the sounds of the street. The city carried on, children called to each other from windows, carts rolled along the damp cobbles, footsteps echoed in alleyways, but here, within the hospital, the world had paused. Nurses and doctors moved quietly, tidying sheets, arranging supplies, and closing ledgers, their movements careful not to disturb the fragile stillness that had settled over the rooms. Dr. Avery stood at the window, gazing toward Whitechapel Road, noting the absence of the usual bustle. He inhaled slowly, letting the damp, smoky air fill his lungs. The streets were still cautious, still fearful, yet a faint rhythm had returned, tentative and uneven, like the pulse of a city awakening from fevered dreams. He turned to the ward, noting the steady rise and fall of Edwin's chest, the empty cots, the careful movements of Eleanor and the remaining staff. The ward that had been a theatre of suffering, vigilance, and dread was finally quiet. Relief mingled with exhaustion. The air still carried traces of illness, yet it felt lighter, tempered by the knowledge that some lives had endured, that some families had survived. The emptiness was a testament, both to the relentlessness of the epidemic and to the resilience of those who had endured it. In Victorian London, a hospital ward emptied after weeks of fever was more than a quiet space. It was a monument to survival, a canvas of absence and endurance, and a fragile bridge between the relentless reach of disease and the tentative hope that life could continue even after the spectre of smallpox had passed. Dr. Nathaniel Avery stood alone in his study, the polished bag of instruments resting heavily on the desk before him. The candlelight trembled, casting long, wavering shadows across the room, the walls lined with shelves of medical texts and leather-bound ledgers filled with names, doses, and observations. Outside, the fog pressed against the city with a soft persistence, curling around chimneys and drifting into the streets with the slow inevitability of time. Inside, Avery exhaled slowly, fingers lingering over the steel instruments that had carried him through weeks of fever, despair, and whispered death. He lifted the scalpel, turning it in his hand as though weighing the lives it had touched. Each tool in the bag bore a story: vials of tinctures, syringes, lancets, and bandages worn thin from repeated use. Each had been applied with care, yet even the most precise action could not counter the relentless tide of smallpox. Families had trusted him with their children, neighbors with their prayers, and he had responded with knowledge and dedication. Yet he carried always the knowledge of limitations. The disease was patient, indifferent, and cruel. Human hands, no matter how skilled, could only guide, soothe, and observe. Avery placed the scalpel carefully back into the bag, noting the faint scratches along its polished edge. Each mark was a testament to its work, to the lives it had encountered. He ran his hand across the surface of the instruments, feeling the smooth metal, cold and unyielding, a reminder that precision alone could not shield him from failure. He exhaled again, the sound heavy with exhaustion, the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest like the fog that now shrouded Whitechapel. He thought of the Harcourts. Young Edwin, fevered and trembling, had survived through diligence, care, and relentless vigilance, but so many others had not. The chalk X's marked homes that would remain empty, the streets that had been avoided now etched with silence, and the hospital wards, though emptied of some, still held the echoes of cries, coughs, and fevered delirium. Each life lost, each family fractured, was a reminder that skill and knowledge were often insufficient against the patient cruelty of disease. Avery moved to the window, drawing back the curtains just enough to peer into the fog-laden streets below. Gas lamps glimmered faintly through the mist, illuminating shadows of homes and alleyways, shuttered windows, and streets emptied of children. The city seemed to breathe in muted rhythm, as though aware of the cost of life within each house, yet indifferent to the suffering. The fog absorbed sound and softened edges, making distance seem greater, and heightening the isolation of the homes that had been marked, visited, and often abandoned. He returned to the desk, running his fingers across the ledger. Names of patients, dates of fever, outcomes meticulously recorded, each entry a quiet confession, a testament to what he could measure, and a reminder of what he could not. His hands, steady through countless nights of care, now rested, empty of purpose, save for the ritual of record-keeping. Finally, Avery closed the bag of instruments. He had done what he could, measured, treated, soothed, and guided, but there were limits even to diligence. The tools, once extensions of skill and hope, now sat silent, waiting for the next crisis, the next fevered child, the next home marked with chalk. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted beyond sleep, and let the quiet settle, the fog pressing against the windows, the candlelight flickering its slow, solemn rhythm. In Victorian London, a doctor who laid down his instruments did not relinquish responsibility, nor did he retreat from compassion. He paused, rested, and bore witness. And in that stillness, the city continued patient, indifferent, and haunted by the shadow of a disease that measured time in suffering and survival, and left men like Avery to reckon with the fragility of life and the weight of duty. The fog had begun to lift over Whitechapel, pale sunlight breaking through the heavy grey to glint faintly upon the damp cobblestones. For weeks, the streets had been hushed, weighed down by fear, illness, and whispered caution. Houses bore the silent authority of chalk X's, mothers kept their children close, and the distant cries of the fevered had been muffled behind tightly drawn curtains. But today, the Harcourt home opened its front door, and a small figure stepped out into the tentative morning light. Clara Harcourt, the youngest daughter, held her mother's hand, her other clutching a well-worn doll. Her face was pale, marked faintly by the shadow of anxiety and confinement, yet her eyes, wide and blinking, reflected the startling clarity of sunlight light she had not fully seen for weeks. The street, still hushed, seemed to lean in as though acknowledging her return, yet keeping cautious distance. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, heads ducked and skirts held close, whispering among themselves. Even the fog seemed hesitant, curling lightly along the edges of doorways and railings, reluctant to intrude upon this fragile moment of freedom. Mrs. Harcourt exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders loosening for the first time in days. She followed her daughter carefully, eyes scanning the street for danger that no longer existed. Nurse Eleanor Byrne trailed behind, her hands steady yet eyes soft with relief, having guided the household through fever, fear, and endless vigilance. Every breath of fresh air seemed to carry the faint scent of coal and damp, of city fog and soot, yet beneath it all was the sweetness of endurance. The fragile perfume of life persisted. Clara paused, lifting her head to the faint sunlight, letting it wash over her pale face. Her small hands unclenched the doll for a moment, her expression curious and wide. She stepped forward cautiously, testing the solid cobblestones beneath her boots. The city seemed unchanged, yet different, familiar streets, refracted through weeks of confinement and fear. Each house bore its own marks of vigilance and survival. Each chimney puffed smoke that carried the faint tang of coal, soot, and the lingering scent of households once touched by fever. The neighbors observed silently, whispering only to themselves, too cautious to speak directly. Mothers clutched their children, boys shuffled quickly past the Harcourt doorstep, and the occasional dog padded softly along the street, nose twitching at the mingled scents of damp stone and lingering illness. Yet Clara walked steadily, a figure both small and monumental, embodying the fragile triumph of survival against a disease that had touched so many lives with its indiscriminate cruelty. Mrs. Harcourt adjusted her daughter's shawl, guiding her slowly down the street, each step a careful negotiation with the world that had once seemed so dangerous. Eleanor followed with measured steps, silently ensuring that the girl remained safe, that no shadow of the past weeks clung too closely. For even in this moment of sunlight, the memories of fever, pustules, and long, sleepless nights lingered like echoes along the street. As they reached the end of Whitechapel Road, Clara paused to inhale the crisp morning air, letting the sunlight fill her chest and face. It was a small, fragile victory, yet monumental in its significance, a return to life, a step beyond confinement, a gesture of hope after weeks of terror. Around her, the city continued cautiously, yet differently, acknowledging the passage of those who had endured. In Victorian London, a girl who walked into sunlight again was more than a survivor. She was a quiet testament to the resilience of children, the diligence of caregivers, and the fragile, enduring hope that persisted even when the streets were filled with fear, the air thick with fog, and the memory of smallpox lingered like a ghost among the houses. The fog had lifted only partially that morning, leaving Whitechapel in a muted, pallid light. The streets, once bustling with cries of vendors, the clatter of carts, and the laughter of children at play, now seemed smaller, narrower, and strangely quiet, as if the city itself had absorbed weeks of fear and retained them in its cobblestones. Every brick, every worn threshold, seemed to remember the events that had unfolded each household, each family, each child, touched by the relentless grip of smallpox. Mrs. Harcourt stepped cautiously from her doorway, her daughter Clara close at hand, still pale from confinement but steady in her small boots. The chalk X that had once glimmered with warning was gone, erased and abandoned. Yet the memory of its presence lingered in the street. Neighbors moved quietly along the pavement, glancing with subdued attention at the house that had been at the center of fear. Their steps were careful, measured, as though the city itself had imparted lessons to every footfall. Some things once seen cannot be forgotten. The marketplace further down the street had returned to its usual rhythm, yet the voices were quieter, subdued, as if polite whispers could mitigate the memory of cries from fevered children and the clink of coffins on late-night carts. Shopkeepers moved behind counters with precise movements, carefully dusting surfaces that had been neglected in weeks of panic, yet their eyes occasionally flicked toward the Harcourt house, acknowledging silently the endurance of the family that had survived. Even the stray cats, usually prowling and bold, now padded with delicate caution, their paws almost whispering against the damp cobblestones. Eleanor Byrne, still present beside the Harcourts, guided them slowly along the street, her eyes sweeping over every doorway and alleyway. The fog lingered in soft folds along the edges of buildings, and she felt, as she had countless times over the past weeks, the weight of memory in the very air. Each step carried echoes, the fevered groans of children, the sharp scent of vinegar and camphor, the distant toll of bells that marked deaths, and the subtle, lingering sorrow of mothers who had watched helplessly. The city's streets had witnessed all of it, and they remembered. Children, once confined and hidden behind doors and shutters, now peered cautiously from windows, tentative and wide-eyed. They had learned lessons from weeks of avoidance and fear. The streets had taught them what could befall houses, the cost of wandering too close, and the signs of those who had endured. Even the youngest knew to regard certain thresholds with quiet respect, and to whisper the names of the afflicted in tones barely audible. In this way, memory had taken root in the city itself, planting vigilance alongside fear. At the corner, the market bell rang, a sound that had been absent for days. It echoed along Whitechapel Road, carrying faintly into every alley and side street. Vendors resumed their work, yet a subtle tension threaded through the movements of all. The city moved again, but not with its former abandon. London had been reshaped, subtly but indelibly, by the weeks of disease. Mrs. Harcourt paused to look back at her home, inhaling the crisp morning air. The windows, though open, reflected pale sunlight, and the faint scent of coal smoke and damp lingered, carrying memories of fever, isolation, and vigilance. The house, and by extension the family, had survived, but the street bore the quiet imprint of what had occurred. Each cobblestone remembered the passage of panic and endurance. Each doorway retained the shadow of those who had endured within. In Victorian London, streets did more than guide footsteps. They held memory. They carried the weight of lives lived and lives lost, the whispers of fear, the traces of endurance, and, in the silent reverence of pavement and fog, the city remembered all. The Harcourt home had long since settled into a fragile routine, though the memory of fever and fear lingered in every shadowed corner. In a quiet parlour, Mrs. Harcourt knelt beside a loose floorboard, carefully prying it free with hands still marked faintly from weeks of care. Beneath it lay a small, leather-bound diary, its edges frayed and softened by time and secrecy. The journal had been hidden there during the worst of Edwin's illness, a precaution born of superstition and instinct alike. Now, with the house reclaiming its stillness, it seemed almost a relic of a past life, yet one heavy with significance. She opened the diary slowly, the hinges creaking softly, the faint smell of parchment and old leather mingling with the lingering scent of camphor. Each page was a record of fear and devotion, of fevered nights spent at a bedside, of the subtle, persistent watchfulness that had defined the household during the smallpox outbreak. Her own handwriting traced the lines, notes about temperature, the spread of pustules, the timing of medicines, the brief moments of clarity in Edwin's delirium. The pages were meticulous, almost obsessive, a chronicle of survival and endurance against a disease that measured its cruelty in hours. Nurse Eleanor Byrne leaned over the diary, her eyes scanning the entries with quiet reverence. "You recorded everything," she murmured. "Every hour, every sound, every breath." She pressed her hand lightly against the worn leather, a gesture almost of mourning. "It is a testament." Indeed, it was. Each page told a story not only of illness, but of resilience. There were entries describing the nights when the fever spiked, when Edwin's small body trembled beneath blankets, and the soft, careful ministrations that had prevented the disease from claiming him outright. There were notes about the smell of vinegar and disinfectant, about the faint, acrid tang of the pustules, about the soot from the fire curling against the walls of the parlour. Every detail was captured, not merely for posterity, but as a shield, a record that could remind the household, the city, and perhaps even the world of what had been endured. Clara, peering over her mother's shoulder, traced a small finger along a particularly fevered entry. "Mama," she whispered, "did Edwin hurt a lot?" "Mrs." Harcourt pressed her hand gently to the child's back, smoothing the hair from her forehead. "He did," she admitted softly. "But we watched over him, we stayed with him, and he survived." The diary lay open, a witness to those unspoken moments, its pages heavy with both suffering and devotion. The entries also noted the quiet, often invisible acts of the household, the burning of bedsheets, the careful washing of linens, the small interventions that might have seemed trivial but had carried immense weight in preventing further spread. There were mentions of neighbours, cautious and distant, their glances and whispers forming a backdrop to the daily struggle within the walls. Each observation was precise, almost clinical, yet imbued with the tremor of human concern, the subtle fear and hope that had defined every movement of the household. As the afternoon light fell through the parlour window, dust motes drifting in the golden haze, Mrs. Harcourt closed the diary and pressed it to her chest. The floorboard would be replaced, concealing the journal once more, but its weight remained, a repository of memory and endurance. In Victorian London, diaries hidden beneath floorboards were more than secret records. They were monuments to survival, archives of fear and care, and quiet testimonies that the human spirit, even in the grip of smallpox, could endure. And in that unassuming house, the diary waited silently, holding the echoes of fevered nights, whispered prayers, and the fragile triumph of life over relentless disease. The fog lay thick across the outskirts of London, pressing low over the rolling hills and the skeletal branches of trees that marked the edge of the city. Beyond the last rows of brick houses and narrow lanes, the graveyard stretched like a silent sea, its headstones mottled with lichen, weathered by years of rain and coal smoke. Each marker bore a name, a date, and the subtle whisper of mortality, yet in the wake of the smallpox epidemic, they seemed to multiply overnight, creating a forest of stone that trembled with stories of lives cut short. Mrs. Harcourt, accompanied by Nurse Eleanor Byrne, walked slowly along the winding paths between the graves, her skirts brushing the damp earth. In her hands she carried a small bundle of flowers, pale and carefully chosen, the delicate scent of lavender mingling faintly with the chill of the morning air. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured, for the graveyard was heavy, not only with fog, but with memory. The whispers of those lost seemed to linger, carried in the subtle rustle of dead leaves, in the soft, uneven creak of wrought-iron gates, and in the faint wind that passed over weathered stones. They approached a freshly dug grave, its mound of earth dark and still, the soil damp from the morning frost. The coffin had been lowered with care, the wood polished and smooth, yet the presence of death remained immediate and tangible. Edwin's fever had subsided, yet the Harcourts had come to pay tribute to others who had not been so fortunate. Neighbours, children, and strangers whose homes had been marked with chalk X's, whose lives had been claimed in the relentless progression of smallpox. Mrs. Harcourt knelt beside the grave, placing her flowers carefully atop the mound, her fingers trembling despite their resolve. Nurse Eleanor stood silently, her eyes tracing the rows of stones that stretched into the fog. She had carried the sick and dying through wards, parlour rooms, and hospital ships, yet even her experience could not dull the weight of this scene. Each stone, each name, each faintly inscribed date was a testament to the reach of disease, the fragility of life, and the indiscriminate cruelty of fever. She inhaled slowly, the damp, earthy scent rising to mingle with the faint perfume of lavender, camphor, and the city's distant smoke. Mrs. Harcourt's thoughts wandered to the families whose children had not survived, whose parents had not returned from sleepless nights at bedsides, and whose homes had remained sealed, empty, and silent. She pressed her palm to the earth, feeling the cold solidity beneath her fingers, imagining the warmth of lives extinguished too soon. The fog pressed closer, curling among the headstones, softening the lines between life and death, memory and reality. A distant crow called, its sound sharp against the muted morning, and the graveyard seemed to respond, the trees and stones reverberating faintly with the echo. In this place, time felt different. It measured sorrow rather than hours, endurance rather than seconds. The city beyond remained unaware of these quiet rites, carrying on with footsteps, carts, and commerce, while here life was honoured in silence, in flowers placed carefully atop mounds of earth, in whispered names that had become prayers. Victorian London's graveyards, particularly at the edges of town, were more than resting places. They were repositories of memory, testimony, and grief. Each stone held a story, each row a chronicle of fear and endurance, and in the fog-laden morning, the cemetery itself seemed alive with the echoes of a city that had weathered smallpox. Mrs. Harcourt rose slowly, brushing damp soil from her skirts. She took Eleanor's hand, and together they walked back toward the street, carrying with them the solemn weight of the dead, the quiet acknowledgement of survival, and the fragile hope that life, however altered, continued beyond the shadowed mounds of earth. The city had begun to awaken in pale sunlight, yet Whitechapel still carried the scent of damp fog, soot, and the lingering echoes of illness. Dr. Avery walked briskly through the narrow lanes, his polished bag swinging at his side, the soles of his boots slick on wet cobblestones. He had received word of a shipment of vaccine arriving at the parish apothecary, carefully prepared, potent in theory, yet frustratingly late. Weeks of fever and death had already passed, and though the medicine might now save some, it could not undo what had been lost, nor erase the memory of suffering that clung to every doorstep. The smallpox epidemic had moved with cruel precision, claiming children before remedies could reach them, fracturing households, and leaving a city wary and cautious. Families like the Harcourts had endured only through vigilance, relentless care, and a blend of luck and endurance. Yet outside their home, others had not been so fortunate. Chalk X's still marked doors, silence still pressed heavily in streets once filled with clamour, and the fog seemed almost sentient, curling into alleyways, as if to carry memory of the departed into every hidden corner. At the apothecary, Mr. Fenwick arranged the newly arrived vials with painstaking care. Each glass container gleamed faintly in the morning light, the scent of alcohol and herbs sharp and almost bitter. The labels were precise, the dosages carefully recorded, yet the very arrival of the medicine felt both triumph and indictment. Too many children had already been lost, and the cure, though potent, had arrived only after the disease had completed much of its work. Eleanor Byrne, standing nearby, observed the vials with steady hands, though her eyes reflected exhaustion and unspoken grief. Dr. Avery accepted the parcels, his fingers brushing lightly over the cool glass. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing against his spine, the knowledge that, despite careful administration, many would never have the chance to benefit. He thought of families who had received letters too late, of households forced into quarantine with no hope, of coffins quietly lowered into the ground at the edges of town, and of nurses who had worked through nights filled with cries and fevered groans. Each vial now carried hope, but it was a hope tethered precariously to survival, too little for those already claimed. The streets, meanwhile, began to hum with tentative life. Neighbors ventured carefully outside, still wary of contagion, still mindful of the chalk X's that had faded but remained remembered in memory and whispered caution. Children, some recovering, others untouched, tiptoed along pavements, their laughter cautious, measured, as though testing the limits of a world still shadowed by sickness. Yet the vaccine promised a measure of protection, a fragile bulwark against the relentless spread of disease that had once moved unchecked through homes and wards. At the Harcourt home, the first doses were administered with solemn care. Edwin, now recovering, received the injection with a mix of fear and resignation. Mrs. Harcourt's hands shook as she held him, Eleanor's steady ministrations guiding each movement. The medicine offered a quiet, almost invisible reassurance, the promise that the worst might be past, that future children might escape the fate already endured by so many. But the city as a whole had been changed irrevocably. Streets remembered fear, homes remembered isolation, and the lingering scent of camphor and vinegar clung stubbornly to walls and fabrics. The cure had arrived, but too late to erase the losses already endured, and the people carried memory alongside hope, a heavy inheritance in Victorian London. In the end, the medicine could not reclaim the dead, nor fully restore innocence. But it marked a turning point, a fragile line between devastation and survival, a glimmer of control in a city, long at the mercy of an unseen, relentless spectre. Weeks had passed since Edwin Harcourt's fever had broken, yet the house remained steeped in the quiet residue of illness. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting elongated shadows across the parlour walls, and the faint smell of camphor lingered like a memory of fear. Mrs. Harcourt sat in her high-backed chair, carefully observing her son as he shuffled about the room, still weak but steady, his small body wrapped in worn blankets. Yet the most striking testament of the ordeal was not in his movements, nor in his fragile voice. It was etched upon his skin. The smallpox had left its mark in intricate patterns across Edwin's cheeks, arms, and torso, pale scars rising like tiny islands against the warmth of recovered flesh. They were silent, cruel, and unalterable, the skin itself a living chronicle of suffering endured and survived. Mrs. Harcourt's fingers traced lightly along the raised textures, feeling each ridge and hollow, remembering nights of fevered cries, restless tossing, and careful ministrations under the faint lamplight. Every scar, every mark, was a reminder of vigilance, patience, and the fragile endurance of life against an indifferent disease. Eleanor Burns stood nearby, her own hands folded in quiet repose, eyes scanning the boy's delicate form. She had tended to him through the worst, through delirium and burning fever, and now bore witness to the aftermath. "They are a map of what was endured," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the thick silence that settled over the parlour. "Each mark tells its own story, each scar a reminder of survival." Edwin glanced at his reflection in the small mirror near the window, catching sight of his face pocked with tiny, raised scars. He pressed a tentative hand to his cheek, and a faint shiver passed over him. In his mind, he could still feel the fever burning beneath his skin, the oppressive heat of the illness pressing against his chest. The scars were the only evidence that he had endured, and endured alone, guided by the unwavering care of those who had watched over him. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes misted as she observed him. The scars told more than the story of one child. They told of a household held in vigil, a mother's sleepless nights, a nurse's tireless care, the smell of vinegar and disinfectant, the burning of linens, and the quiet passing of days measured in watchful breaths rather than hours. Each mark was a chronicle of fear and hope intertwined, a tactile record of London's smallpox epidemic etched into flesh and memory alike. Beyond the house, the city pressed on with a tentative rhythm, though its streets still carried the echoes of the recent outbreak. Children moved cautiously, mothers whispered instructions, and the fog that had once cloaked Whitechapel still lingered faintly, curling along walls and pavements, a soft reminder of the days when fear had walked the streets as visibly as the living. Even the chalk X's, faded or erased, remained in memory, marking thresholds in time that could not be forgotten. Eleanor spoke again, quieter now, almost to herself. "We can only bear witness, and remember. The scars remain, yes, but they also speak of endurance, of life preserved in the smallest margins." Edwin ran a small hand over his arm again, pale fingers brushing against the raised skin. In that tactile record, he sensed the memory of care, of vigilance, and of the quiet determination of those who had refused to let fear claim more than it already had. In Victorian London, the skin told stories that words could not. It remembered fear, suffering, devotion, and survival. And on Edwin Harcourt's cheeks and arms, the story of an entire household, a community, and a city had been etched in flesh, permanent, silent, and impossible to ignore. The sun had long since slipped behind the grey horizon, leaving Whitechapel wrapped in a veil of mist and shadow. The streets, once thronged with cautious neighbours and whispered warnings, now seemed almost deserted, save for the occasional tread of boots over damp cobblestones. The city exhaled in quiet, as if holding its breath for the last traces of a spectre that had haunted it for weeks. Within the Harcourt home, the air felt heavier still, a lingering residue of fever, fear, and vigilance. Edwin Harcourt lay in his bed, finally at peace, though his body bore the enduring testimony of smallpox. Each pustule that had marked him now stood as a silent scar, pale and raised, tracing a map of suffering survived. Nurse Eleanor Burns sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap, eyes weary but alert, listening to the faint, steady rise and fall of the boy's chest. The fever, which had once gripped the household with unrelenting cruelty, was now only a memory, a ghost that would linger in the quiet of minds and in the subtle smells of the home. Mrs. Harcourt moved softly through the parlour, smoothing blankets, adjusting the curtains, attending to the minutiae that had become ritual over the past weeks. Every motion was both practical and symbolic, a reclaiming of space, of life, of domestic normalcy in a house that had been dominated by illness. She paused by the mirror, eyes lingering on her own reflection. The toll of sleepless nights, the quiet panic, the hours spent at her son's bedside, all were etched in the lines of her face, subtle but unmistakable. The ghost of the last fever was not merely in the body, but in memory, in the tremor of hands, in the lingering scent of vinegar and camphor. Outside, fog pressed against windows and rooftops, curling along the streets like smoke from an unextinguished fire. The chalk X's that had once marked the homes of the afflicted had faded, erased by hands too weary to recall them. Yet the memory of their presence lingered, a silent witness to the weeks when fear dictated movement, where doors remained closed and neighbours observed from a distance. Every street, every threshold, seemed imbued with the faint echo of those days, a reminder that even as life resumed, the city had been irrevocably altered. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain slightly to observe the quiet street. Houses were open again. Children ventured slowly, their laughter cautious but genuine. Mothers whispered instructions, neighbours exchanged polite nods, and the city exhaled a tentative rhythm of life renewed. Yet the fog, curling low over the pavement, seemed to hold a residue of memory, the echo of fevered cries, the rustle of linens, the quiet ministrations of devoted hands. The ghost of the last fever had not left entirely. It lingered in the air, a soft and persistent shadow. Mrs. Harcourt returned to the bedside, placing her hand over Edwin's, feeling the warmth of recovery beneath her fingertips. She whispered a soft blessing, a murmur of gratitude for life preserved, for endurance, for the quiet bravery that had carried them through weeks of terror. The house, now silent except for the soft tick of the clock and the boy's breathing, seemed to sigh in relief, exhaling years of tension in one long, measured breath. In Victorian London, the ghost of the last fever remained long after the city resumed its rhythm. It lived in scarred flesh, in quiet memories, in households once hallowed by vigilance and fear. And in the Harcourt home, that ghost, pale, patient, and indelible, served as both a warning and a testament that life, though fragile and beset by unseen cruelty, endured, that the fever could be survived, that the city, scarred but alive, would continue to breathe beneath the fog, beneath the memory, beneath the watchful skies. The last fever had passed. Its ghost remained, and with it a quiet, enduring echo of survival.